haven't told anyone about this. Not the police, not my sister, certainly not the people I see every day in the village. There's a specific kind of weight that comes with knowing something you can't unknow. A heaviness that sits right at the base of your throat, making every swallow feel like a conscious effort. I suppose I'm writing this down because I need to get it out of my head before it rots there. If you're listening to this or reading it, I just want you to understand that I wasn't looking for trouble. I'm not a curious person by nature. I'm a furniture restorer. I spend my days with sandpaper, beeswax, and the quiet company of dead men's wardrobes. It's a solitary life, and usually that's exactly how I like it. I live in a small stone-built cottage just outside of a place called Minchinhampton in the Cotswolds. It's the kind of village where the most exciting thing that happens is a dispute over a garden fence or a particularly heavy frost on the common. My workshop is a converted barn at the back of the property. It's filled with the smell of turpentine and old oak. About 4 months ago, I picked up a piece at a probate auction in Cirencester. It was a mid-19th century Davenport, a small ornamental desk with a sloped top. It was in a sorry state, caked in layers of cheap varnish that some previous owner had slapped on in the 70s, but the bones of it were good. The Davenport had belonged to a man named Mr. Henderson. He'd been a retired schoolmaster, well liked in his village, a man of routine and quiet dignity. He'd lived alone for 20 years after his wife passed away in the late 90s. I remember seeing him once or twice at the local library. A thin man with a sharp nose and eyes that always seemed to be looking for a mistake in a piece of prose. When he died, he left no heirs, so his entire estate went to auction. I paid about £80 for the desk, thinking it would be a nice project for the autumn. It sat in the corner of my workshop for a few weeks before I got around to it. The weather had turned cold, that damp English cold that gets into your joints, and I spent my mornings by the wood burner, drinking tea and looking at the work ahead. When I finally started stripping the wood, I felt that familiar satisfaction of seeing the real grain emerge from beneath the gunk. It was beautiful walnut. But as I was cleaning out the small side drawers, I noticed a discrepancy in the depth of the bottom one. You'd be surprised how many old desks have secret compartments. Usually they're empty, or they contain a few halfpennies, a dried out inkwell, or perhaps a yellowing letter from a long dead lover. This one, however, had a small, modern-looking USB drive tucked into a velvet-lined slot behind the false back of a drawer. It looked completely out of place against the Victorian joinery, a jagged piece of the 21st century buried in the 19th. I should have thrown it in the bin. That's the thought that loops in my mind every night when the house gets quiet and the shadows start to stretch. I should have just tossed it into the scrap pile and gone back to my beeswax. But it was a rainy Tuesday, the tea was cold, and the solitude of the barn felt a bit too heavy. I took the drive into the house and plugged it into my laptop, sitting at my kitchen table with the rain drumming against the glass. There wasn't much on it, just a single text file. No name, no date. When I opened it, there was a string of letters and numbers that looked like gibberish, followed by a series of instructions. It didn't look like a normal web address. It was long, messy, and ended in a suffix I didn't recognize. Below that was a password, the Gleaner. I'm not a tech person. I use my computer for invoices, ordering brass handles, and looking up upholstery fabrics. But I'd heard enough over the years to know what this was. I'd heard the stories about the parts of the internet that don't show up on a search engine, the hidden layers that require specific pathways to access, what people call the dark web. I didn't think it was dangerous. I thought it was a curiosity, a relic of whoever had owned that desk. Perhaps a secret life of Mr. Henderson that no one in the village would have suspected. I followed the instructions, which involved a few settings changes I had to look up on my phone, and eventually I found myself staring at a screen that was almost entirely black. There were no images, no banners, just plain white typewriter-style font on a charcoal background. At the top, it simply stated, "The Registry of Open Doors." I remember feeling a bit let down. It sounded like something to do with architecture, or perhaps a charity for the homeless. I clicked the only link on the page, which was a list of UK counties. I scrolled down to Gloucestershire. The page that loaded was a table. It had 4 columns: town, village, street, entry point, and status. I started scrolling, my heart beginning to do that slow, heavy thud against my ribs. These weren't shops or businesses. They were houses, private homes: Stroud, Bisley Road, kitchen window, faulty latch, occupied, Cheltenham, Lansdowne Crescent, basement door, key under stone, unoccupied, Holiday, Nailsworth, Shortwood, back door, always left open for cat. I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with the draft in my cottage. I kept scrolling, my eyes blurring as I looked for names I knew. I found a house in Minchinhampton, just 3 miles from where I was sitting. It described a bungalow on the edge of the common, where an elderly woman lived. It noted that she often forgot to bolt the side door after taking the bins out on a Wednesday evening. It even mentioned the time, usually around 9 at night. This wasn't a site for hackers or some grand criminal enterprise. It was a ledger for people who liked to go where they weren't invited. It was a community of shadows. There were no memberships or chat rooms, just this cold, clinical list of vulnerabilities. It was a map of how to slip into the lives of strangers. I sat there for a long time, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the window glass. I felt like I was looking at a map of a world I didn't belong in, a world that existed parallel to the one where people bought milk and complained about the weather. I told myself it was probably fake, some kind of elaborate prank, or an old file that hadn't been updated in years. To prove it to myself, I decided to check one of the entries. The bungalow in Minchinhampton was only a short drive away. I told myself I was going there to make sure the woman was safe. I told myself I'd just check the door, and if it was open, I'd knock and tell her to be more careful. It was about 10 o'clock at night. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. I parked my car a few streets away and walked. The bungalow was quiet. The lights dimmed. I felt like a criminal just walking up the driveway, my boots crunching on the gravel. I crept around to the side of the house, my breath hitching in my chest. There it was, a white UPVC door. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pressed the handle. It clicked. The door swung open an inch, revealing the dark, warm interior of a utility room. The smell of fabric softener and old dog drifted out into the night air. I didn't knock. I didn't warn her. I was so terrified by the reality of it that I pulled the door shut, making sure the latch engaged, and I ran. I ran all the way back to my car, my lungs burning, the taste of copper in my mouth. When I got home, I went straight back to the laptop. I wanted to close the page, to delete the file, to pretend I'd never seen it. But as I moved the mouse, I noticed a new link had appeared at the bottom of the Gloucestershire page. It was titled Recent Observations. I clicked it. It was a log of visits. It wasn't just a list of doors. It was a diary of intrusions. People described the things they did once they were inside. They didn't steal anything. That was the most unsettling part. There were no reports of missing jewelry or televisions. Instead, They wrote about sitting in people's armchairs while they slept upstairs. They wrote about moving a single photograph from one shelf to another. They wrote about breathing the same air as a sleeping family and then leaving without a trace. One entry, dated only 2 nights prior, described a house in Cirencester. The visitor had spent roughly 3 hours in the kitchen. They had made themselves a cup of tea, washed the mug, and put it back in the wrong cupboard. They described the sound of the husband snoring in the room directly above them. They mentioned the brand of toothpaste in the bathroom. They even noted that the couple's cat had sat on their lap for a portion of the visit. I felt physically sick. The mundane nature of it was far worse than any story of a break-in I'd ever heard. This was a violation of the very idea of home. It was the knowledge that your most private spaces were being treated like a public gallery by strangers who wanted nothing more than to prove they could be there. They weren't after your money, they were after your sense of security. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. I checked my own locks 4-5 times an evening. I installed a motion sensor light over the workshop door. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the ivy sounded like a footstep. I kept thinking about that USB drive. Why was it in that desk? Who had been using it? The more I thought about Mr. Henderson, the more I wondered. Had he been a visitor, or had he been a victim who had somehow discovered the drive? The clinical, precise nature of the text on the drive seemed to match his personality, but I couldn't reconcile the image of the kindly schoolmaster with the person who would stand in a stranger's utility room at 3 a.m. On the 4th night, I couldn't help myself. I went back on the site. I had to know if there was more. I needed to see if my own house was on there. I searched for my village. There was only one entry. Minchinhampton, the old barn cottage. My heart stopped. That was me. That was my home. I clicked the entry. It didn't just list the door. It was much more detailed than the others. It described the workshop side window and how the wooden frame was rotted at the base. It explained that a firm push would bypass the lock entirely. It also mentioned that the internal door leading from the workshop to the kitchen was usually left on the latch. I looked toward the kitchen door. I'd lived here for 6 years, and I'd never once thought about that rot in the workshop window. I always kept the internal door closed, but on the latch was exactly how I left it, so the heat from the aga would reach the back of the house. It was a detail I'd never shared with anyone. I scrolled down to the observations for my house. There were 3 entries. The first was from about a month ago. Visited between 2:15 and 3:45. Subject sleeps heavily. The house smells of linseed oil and old paper. Moved the bookmarks in 3 books on the bedside table. Subject did not wake. I remembered that. I'd woken up and found my place lost in the biography of Thomas Chippendale I was reading. I'd assumed I'd just been tired and forgotten where I was. I felt a wave of cold sweat break across my forehead. They had been in my bedroom. They had been standing inches from my face while I slept. The second entry, visited 1:10. Subject was in the workshop late. Watched through the gap in the barn doors. Subject is restoring the Henderson Davenport. Left a small gift in the hidden compartment for them to find. Curious to see if they follow the trail. The room seemed to tilt. The gift, the USB drive, it hadn't belonged to Mr. Henderson at all. It had been left there for me. It was an invitation. I was being recruited, or perhaps just mocked. They had watched me find it. They had watched me bring it into the house. I couldn't breathe. I was sitting in the very chair where they had watched me sleep. I looked at the dark corners of the living room, the shadows cast by the floor lamp, suddenly seeming deep and hungry. I wasn't alone in my own life. I was a character in someone else's hobby. The third entry was dated today. The timestamp was only about 10 minutes old. Subject is currently viewing the registry. They look distressed. They are sitting in the green armchair. They should have stayed in the workshop. It's much harder to leave a gift when they are awake. The laptop screen flickered. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice felt like it had been physically cut out of my throat. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the text. They are looking at the kitchen door now, the screen read. I didn't turn around. I couldn't bring myself to look. I just sat there, in the silence of the Gloucestershire countryside, listening to the slow, rhythmic sound of someone breathing in the darkness of the hallway behind me. The breathing wasn't hurried. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, matter-of-fact, and terrifyingly close. It was the sound of someone who felt completely at home in my house. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That someone had been moving my bookmarks? That I'd found a website that shouldn't exist? I just stayed in that chair until the sun came up and the first light of dawn began to grey the windows. When the light finally hit the kitchen floor, the house was empty. The internal door to the workshop was wide open. I've moved now. I couldn't stay there. I sold the cottage at a loss, sold the workshop, and took a small modern flat in a busy part of Bristol. There are 3 locks on my door and a security camera that feeds directly to my phone. I don't restore furniture anymore. I work in a warehouse, surrounded by people and bright fluorescent lights. But the fear hasn't left me. It's just changed shape. The mundane nature of the visits on that site, the tea making, the photograph moving, it makes every small inconsistency in my life feel like a threat. If I can't find my keys, I don't think I've lost them. I think someone has hidden them. If a window is slightly ajar, I don't think it's the wind. I think someone is testing the frame. I haven't gone back to the site. I destroyed the USB drive, smashed it with a hammer until it was nothing but plastic and metal dust, and threw the remains into the River Avon. But I know it's still there. The registry never closes. It just waits for someone else to find a secret, to feel a bit of curiosity on a rainy Tuesday, and to open a door that can never be shut again. I think about the others on that list. The woman in the bungalow, the family in Cirencester. I wonder how many of them are currently being observed. I wonder how many people in this country are living their lives as the unwitting subjects of a silent audience. I stayed up late last night. I couldn't help it. I was sitting on my sofa, looking at the camera feed on my phone. The hallway was empty. The door was locked. But then I noticed something. On the small table by the door, where I keep my post, a single envelope had been moved. It was now sitting at a perfectly right angle to the edge of the table. I know I didn't leave it like that. I looked at the camera footage, scrolling back through the hours. There was nothing. No one had entered. No one had left. But the envelope had moved. That's the real horror of the dark web. It's not just the things you find there. It's the way those things bleed into the real world, turning your own home into a place where you are the stranger. It's the realization that some people don't want to hurt you, or rob you, or even talk to you. They just want to watch you. They want to be the ghost in your machine, the shadow in your hallway, the person who knows exactly how you take your tea, even if you've never met them. I'm sitting here now, in my flat in Bristol, writing this. The sun is setting over the city, and the street lights are starting to flicker on. It's a normal Tuesday evening, but I can hear the lift in the hallway moving. I can hear the muffled sounds of my neighbors, and I can't help but wonder if one of them is currently logging into a black screen, looking for a list of counties, and scrolling down until they find a street they recognize. I think I'll go and check the logs one more time. Not that it matters. If the registry has taught me anything, it's that a lock is just a suggestion to someone who really wants to be inside. And as I walk toward the door, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in a darkened room, someone is watching me move, waiting for me to settle down for the night, so they can leave me another gift. I haven't slept properly in months. Every time I close my eyes, I see that white text on the charcoal background. I see the list of names, the list of vulnerabilities. I see the clinical descriptions of people's lives. It's a ledger of human fragility. We think our walls protect us, but they only provide the illusion of privacy. We are all just entries in a database we didn't ask to be part of. The furniture restoration business taught me that everything has a hidden side. Every piece of wood has a grain that's buried. Every drawer has a space behind it. I thought I was uncovering beauty. I didn't realize I was uncovering a way for the darkness to get in. If you find something in an old desk, or a hidden drawer, or a box in the attic, leave it. Don't be curious. Don't look for the secret. Because once you know how the door is opened, you can never really believe it's closed again. I'm looking at my phone now. The camera feed is still clear. The hallway is still empty. But the air in the room feels different. It feels occupied. And as I reach for my tea, I notice that the mug is turned slightly to the left. Just enough to be noticed. Just enough to let me know that the visit has already begun. I'm not going to turn around. I'm just going to keep writing until the light goes. Because as long as I'm writing, I'm awake. And as long as I'm awake, they have to wait. But eventually, I'll have to sleep. And that's when the registry really begins its work. The silence of the city is different from the silence of the Cotswolds, but it's no less heavy. In the village, you could blame the wind or the owls. Here, there are only people, thousands of people, all living behind their own doors, all thinking they're safe. I wonder how many of them are on the list tonight. I wonder how many of them will wake up tomorrow and find their bookmark has moved, or their tea has been made, and they'll just shrug it off as a trick of the mind. I wish I could go back to being one of them. I wish I could go back to the days when a creak in the floor was just a creak. But those days are gone. The door is open, and I don't think it's ever going to close. I can hear a faint scratching sound now, coming from the direction of the front door. It's rhythmic, slow, like a fingernail against wood. I'm not going to look. I'm just going to sit here and wait for the morning. It's only a few more hours. I can make it to the morning. I have to. Because if I don't, I'll just be another observation in the log. Another story for someone to read on a black screen in the middle of the night. Another life gleaned by the people who walk in the shadows. I think I hear the handle turning. I'm just going to keep my eyes on the screen. Picture a scenario where you've worked somewhere for 8 years, put in the overtime, covered for colleagues when they called in sick, never missed a deadline, and then one Tuesday morning, your manager calls you into his office and tells you the company is restructuring. Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and they'll post your belongings within a week. That's what happened to me 3 months ago. My name is Martin, I'm 42, and until recently I was a project coordinator at a logistics company in Reading. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I was good at it. The manager who fired me was a man called David Henley, someone who'd been brought in 6 months earlier to implement cost-cutting measures. He'd barely spoken to me before that Tuesday, but he delivered the news with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he'd done this many times before. What made it worse was that I knew the restructuring was selective. 3 people from my department were let go, but they kept on 2 others who did essentially the same work, just less efficiently. The decision seemed arbitrary, personal even, though I couldn't understand what I might have done to warrant being singled out. The first few weeks after losing the job were occupied with practical concerns. Updating my CV, applying for positions, dealing with benefits paperwork, explaining to friends and family why I was suddenly unemployed. But as the rejections started coming in and the savings began dwindling, the anger began building. Not just frustration at the job market or the economic situation, but genuine rage at David Henley specifically. I found myself thinking about him constantly, imagining confrontations where I'd tell him exactly what I thought of his management style, scenarios where he'd face consequences for his casual destruction of people's livelihoods. The fantasies became increasingly violent over time, though I told myself it was just a way of processing the stress and disappointment. Late one evening, after another day of fruitless job searching, I found myself researching David Henley online. Not for any specific purpose, just curiosity about the man who'd upended my life. His LinkedIn profile, company photos, mentions in trade publications. Nothing particularly revealing, but it felt like I was learning something useful about my enemy. The search led me to forums where people discussed workplace grievances and unfair dismissals. Most of the posts were routine complaints about bad managers and corporate policies, but some were more extreme. People talking about revenge fantasies, sharing stories about bosses who'd faced various misfortunes, discussing hypothetical scenarios that went well beyond anything I'd imagined. One forum in particular caught my attention. The discussions were coded and vague, but seemed to revolve around more serious forms of retaliation than just complaining online. Users would reference services and contacts in ways that suggested real-world consequences rather than just fantasy. The tone was matter-of-fact, practical, as if they were discussing hiring a tradesman rather than something far more serious. I started visiting that forum regularly, not posting anything myself, but reading through the discussions and trying to understand what was actually being offered. After several weeks of lurking, I received a private message from someone who'd noticed my browsing patterns. They didn't introduce themselves with any dramatic usernames or obvious criminal references, just someone called Mike, who seemed to understand what I might be looking for. The conversation that followed was surprisingly normal. Mike asked about my employment situation, my financial pressures, my feelings about the people responsible for my difficulties. He seemed genuinely sympathetic, offering practical advice about job searching alongside more pointed questions about my former manager. Sometimes he'd ask oddly personal things, how well I slept at night, whether I had family who worried about me, if I'd ever felt capable of crossing lines I wouldn't normally cross. I assumed it was just thorough customer service. Over several exchanges, Mike gradually introduced the idea that some workplace problems required more direct intervention than traditional legal channels could provide. He provided links to sites that looked like professional service directories, complete with user reviews and detailed pricing. The services range from relatively minor harassment to more permanent solutions. Everything was presented with corporate professionalism. No dramatic threats or criminal iconography, just matter-of-fact discussions of problems and solutions. The option I found myself considering was listed as executive adjustment services. The description was euphemistic but clear enough, and the reviews suggested genuine experience rather than imagination. The details felt just real enough, never specific enough to be incriminating. Mike seemed to sense my interest without me explicitly stating it. His messages became more focused on practical considerations, timelines, payment methods, information requirements for service providers. He spoke like someone managing a service contract, not arranging a crime. What made it feel legitimate was the systematic approach. They required detailed information about the target, including daily routines, security arrangements, and personal circumstances. The data collection process was thorough and professional, suggesting genuine operational capability rather than simple fraud or fantasy. I found myself gathering information about David Henley without quite admitting what I was planning to do with it. His home address, his car, his typical schedule, his family situation. The research felt purposeful and focused, giving me something constructive to do with the anger and frustration that had been building for months. The information gathering became increasingly detailed over time. I started following his routine, noting his lunch preferences, his gym schedule, his weekend activities. Not obviously stalking, just casual observation that helped me understand his patterns and vulnerabilities. The knowledge felt powerful, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had previously been entirely outside my influence. Mike's messages became more specific as I provided information. He would reference details I'd shared, suggest additional areas for research, and gradually build a comprehensive profile of David Henley's daily life. The collaboration felt professional and goal-oriented, like working on a legitimate project rather than planning something illegal. Around this time, I started noticing changes in my own circumstances that seemed oddly convenient. Job interviews for positions I didn't remember applying for. Meetings arranged by recruitment consultants I'd never contacted. Opportunities appearing with timing that felt deliberate. The interviews were for positions similar to my previous role, with companies that seemed legitimate enough. But the conversations would drift into uncomfortable territory. Questions about workplace stress, my thoughts on management accountability, whether I'd ever considered taking matters into my own hands when official channels failed. The interviewers seemed more interested in my emotional state than my professional qualifications. I began to wonder whether Mike's organization provided services beyond just executive adjustment, whether they were also involved in monitoring and managing clients, ensuring that people considering their services received appropriate guidance and support throughout the decision-making process. The job opportunities became more pressing over time. Offers for temporary positions that would require travel, consulting arrangements that would take me away from Reading for extended periods, opportunities that seemed designed to interrupt my research and planning activities. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. Mike's messages became more urgent as well. He mentioned limited availability for executive adjustment services, suggested that delays might affect pricing or scheduling, emphasized the importance of making decisions quickly before opportunities disappeared. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. I arranged to meet Mike in person to finalize the arrangements, not at his suggestion, but because I wanted to confirm that I was dealing with legitimate professionals rather than elaborate scammers. The meeting was scheduled for a pub in central Reading, public enough to feel safe but private enough for sensitive discussion. Mike turned out to be exactly what I'd expected, middle-aged, professionally dressed, the sort of person you might encounter in any business context. But as we talked, I began to notice things that seemed inconsistent with the straightforward transaction I'd imagined. He seemed to know more about my personal circumstances than I'd shared in our online conversations, details about my financial situation, my housing arrangements, my social connections. When I asked direct questions about operational details, his answers became vague, He couldn't provide specific timelines, wouldn't explain methods, seemed reluctant to discuss practical aspects. Instead, he focused on my motivations. He wanted to understand why I felt David Henley deserved this level of intervention, whether I'd considered alternatives, how I planned to deal with the aftermath. The conversation felt more like a psychological evaluation than a business meeting. When I pressed for concrete commitments and timelines, Mike suggested that I needed more time to consider the decision properly. He recommended taking a few weeks to think through all the implications, perhaps exploring some of the job opportunities that had been appearing, reconsidering whether this level of intervention was really necessary. The meeting ended without any definitive arrangements being made. Mike gave me his contact details and suggested I should reach out when I was completely certain about proceeding. But something about his demeanor suggested that he expected me to change my mind rather than follow through with the original plan. Over the following days, I found myself questioning everything about the interaction. Whether Mike was actually connected to the services I thought I was purchasing, whether the whole setup was legitimate, whether I'd been dealing with professionals or something else entirely. By that point, the job offers had become more frequent and attractive. Legitimate positions with real companies, offering salaries that would resolve my financial difficulties immediately. Again, the timing felt too convenient, as if someone was actively working to provide alternatives to the executive adjustment services I'd been considering. I also started noticing that people seemed to recognize me more often. Once, a stranger mentioned the street I lived on in a casual conversation, though I didn't recall seeing him before. Another time, a shop assistant asked how my job search was going, though I'd never discussed it with anyone at that store. When I tried to contact Mike again, his account had been deactivated. The forums I'd been using showed error messages, and the service websites appeared to be under maintenance. All evidence of the executive adjustment option had become inaccessible. The job offers continued arriving though. Positions that seemed specifically designed for my skills and experience, with companies that had apparently heard good things about my work despite my recent unemployment, opportunities that would require relocation, keeping me busy and providing new focus for my attention. I accepted one of them eventually, a project coordination role with a company in Birmingham, better salary than my previous position, responsibilities that felt familiar and comfortable. The interview process was surprisingly brief, and they'd seemed eager to have me start as soon as possible. 3 weeks after starting the new job, I learned that David Henley had been found dead in his home. Apparent heart attack, no signs of foul play, nothing suspicious according to the police investigation. He was 45, no previous health problems, found by his wife when she returned from visiting her mother. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, but I had no way of determining whether his death was connected to my previous planning or simply random misfortune. I'd never completed any arrangements with Mike, never paid for any services, never provided final confirmation that I wanted to proceed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something larger than I'd understood, that my research and planning had been monitored and incorporated into activities I hadn't been aware of, that what I started had finished itself, with or without my permission. The new job kept me busy enough to avoid dwelling on questions I couldn't answer. My colleagues were friendly, my manager was supportive, and the work environment felt positive in ways my previous employment never had. Life improved substantially, making it easier to forget about the strange period of unemployment and planning. Sometimes I wonder if it all started long before I lost that job. not sure if I should have called the police straight away, but hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? What happened was this. I came home to my flat to find a package that definitely wasn't mine sitting outside my door. Nothing unusual there. Happens all the time in student accommodation, where delivery drivers get confused about flat numbers and names. The label showed my address, but a completely different name. Someone called David Chen, who I'd never heard of. The package was from a medical supply company, which struck me as odd, given that most students aren't ordering specialized medical equipment. But I figured maybe this David person had a condition that required particular supplies, and I'd just drop it round to wherever he actually lived once I worked out the correct address. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of just leaving it for the delivery company to sort out, I decided to have a quick look online to see if I could find contact details for the intended recipient. It might save everyone some hassle if I could arrange for him to collect the item directly. Searching for David Chen in Glasgow turned up nothing useful. Too common a name. But when I looked more closely at the return address on the package, I noticed it wasn't from any medical supply company I could find online. The address led to what appeared to be a generic business park with multiple tenants, none of whom seemed to be in the medical supply business. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging deeper into where this package might actually have come from. The more I searched, the more I found myself following links to increasingly obscure websites that seemed to exist in corners of the internet I'd never encountered before. Eventually, I ended up on sites that required specific access methods and weren't indexed by normal search engines. Places where medical supplies were being sold without the usual regulatory oversight and customer verification that legitimate companies would require. The supplies being offered weren't your typical pharmacy items. These were specialized medical devices, pharmaceutical compounds, and equipment that would normally require prescriptions or professional medical supervision to obtain legally. Most concerning was that many items were being marketed for uses that had nothing to do with legitimate medical treatment. Substances described as useful for behavioral modification or compliance enhancement, devices that could be used for restraint or monitoring, even chemicals that seemed designed for incapacitating rather than treating people. I realized I might be holding a package containing materials that were intended for harming rather than helping someone. The medical supply company was a front for distributing items that could be used for assault, kidnapping, or worse. But that raised the question of who David Chen actually was and why someone was having these materials delivered to an address near mine. Either he lived in the area and was involved in activities that required access to dangerous medical supplies, or someone was using a false name and approximate address to receive materials they couldn't obtain through legitimate channels. The package was heavier than I'd initially noticed, and when I shook it gently, I could hear what sounded like multiple small containers or vials moving around inside. This product is definitely not what you'd expect from normal medical supplies. I tried to research David Chen more systematically, looking through university records, local business directories, and social media to see if I could find anyone by that name who might legitimately be expecting medical deliveries. What I found instead were references to the same name being used in connection with various questionable online activities, forum posts about acquiring controlled substances, marketplace reviews for sellers of restricted items, even what appeared to be requests for services that couldn't be discussed on normal platforms. The name seemed to be a commonly used alias for people who needed to maintain anonymity while purchasing items or services that weren't available through legitimate channels. I was probably holding a package intended for someone involved in serious criminal activities, delivered to an address close enough to mine that they could collect it without being traced to their actual location, but I had no way of knowing whether the intended recipient was planning to use these materials against specific victims, or whether failing to deliver the package might prompt them to investigate what had happened to their order. If David Chen was expecting delivery of materials he planned to use for harming someone, discovering that his package had been intercepted might make him desperate enough to take risks to recover it. That could put me in danger if he decided I was a threat to his activities. On the other hand, if I delivered the package as intended, I'd be facilitating whatever crime he was planning to commit against innocent victims who had no idea they were being targeted. I decided the safest option was to dispose of the package without opening it or trying to return it to its intended recipient. If David Chen was involved in legitimate medical treatment, he could reorder his supplies through proper channels. If he was planning to harm someone, denying him access to these materials might prevent serious crimes. But getting rid of medical supplies safely required more thought than just throwing them in the bin. If the package contained controlled substances or hazardous materials, improper disposal could create environmental problems or give other people access to dangerous items. I tried to research proper disposal methods for unknown medical materials, but most guidance assumed you knew what substances you were dealing with and had obtained them legally in the first place. Eventually, I decided to take the package to the University Health Center and explain that I'd received someone else's medical delivery by mistake. They might be able to dispose of it safely or contact appropriate authorities if the contents appeared suspicious. But when I arrived at the health center, the staff seemed unusually interested in the package details and asked more questions than I'd expected about how I'd received it and what I knew about the intended recipient. Their reaction suggested they were familiar with packages containing questionable medical supplies and might have dealt with similar situations before. The health center staff seemed to have protocols for handling suspicious medical deliveries that weren't part of their normal patient care procedures. After providing detailed information about the package and signing several forms, I left thinking the situation was resolved. The health center would handle disposal appropriately, and I could forget about David Chen and whatever he'd been planning to do with his medical supplies. But that evening, I received a phone call from someone claiming to represent the medical supply company, asking about a delivery that had apparently gone missing from my address. They seemed to know specific details about the package and were very concerned about recovering their materials quickly. When I explained that I'd turned the package over to university authorities because it had been delivered to the wrong address, the caller became agitated and insisted that the materials were urgently needed for a legitimate medical emergency. They offered to arrange immediate collection from the health center and seemed willing to pay substantial compensation for any inconvenience I'd experienced due to the delivery error. The level of concern and urgency seemed excessive for a simple delivery mistake, especially from a company that was supposedly just sending routine medical supplies to a regular customer. I started to suspect that David Chen and the medical supply company were working together to recover materials that were much more valuable or dangerous than normal medical equipment. When I checked with the University Health Center the next day, they told me the package had already been collected by someone claiming to represent both the medical supply company and the intended recipient. The collection had happened within hours of my dropping it off, suggesting that David Chen and his associates had been monitoring the situation and were prepared to act quickly to recover their materials once they discovered where the package had ended up. But most disturbing was that the person who'd collected the package had provided detailed information about me, my name, course details, and home address, as proof that they were authorized to recover materials that had been mistakenly delivered to my location. They'd been watching me carefully enough to gather personal information, that could be used to convince university staff that they had legitimate reasons for collecting the package I'd turned in. That meant David Chen and his associates now knew exactly who I was and where I lived, and they understood that I'd been curious enough about their activities to investigate the package rather than simply ignoring the delivery error. I'd gone from being an innocent bystander who'd received someone else's mail to being a person of interest for people who were involved in illegal medical supply distribution and potentially much more serious criminal activities. The package I'd tried to dispose of responsibly had instead led me into direct contact with people who now had reason to consider me either potential threat to their operations or a possible recruit for activities that required access to the specialized medical supplies they'd been trying to obtain. When I got home that night, there was another package waiting outside my door, this time addressed to me personally and containing a handwritten note thanking me for my assistance with the previous delivery and inviting me to participate in what was described as a lucrative opportunity for students who were interested in discreet medical supply logistics. I should probably mention up front that I've always been terrible at keeping secrets, so writing this down feels like a massive mistake, but I need to get it out of my head somehow. The whole thing started when my mum called me at university in Newcastle, worried because she hadn't heard from my gran in over a week. Gran lived alone in a little terraced house in Sunderland and usually phoned every few days, but she'd gone completely silent. Mum was stuck at work and couldn't drive up to check on her until the weekend, so she asked if I could pop round after lectures. It seemed like a simple enough favour. Just knock on the door, make sure Gran was all right, maybe stay for a cup of tea and listen to her complain about the neighbours. The sort of family obligation that takes an hour out of your day and makes everyone feel better. But when I got to Grand Street that Thursday afternoon, her house was completely dark, and there was a pile of uncollected posts behind the front door. I rang the bell and knocked repeatedly, but got no response. The curtains were drawn tight, and I couldn't see any signs of life inside. I was starting to worry that something serious had happened when I noticed a man watching me from across the street. He was standing by a white van, pretending to check his phone, but clearly keeping an eye on what I was doing at Gran's house. When I looked directly at him, he walked over and introduced himself as someone from the council's Adult Social Services Department. He explained that they'd received reports about an elderly resident who might need assistance, and he was there to conduct a welfare check. The timing seemed like more than coincidence. I just arrived to check on my Gran, and a social worker happened to be doing the same thing at exactly the same moment. But his identification looked legitimate, and he seemed genuinely concerned about Gran's well-being. He suggested we try to gain entry together to make sure she was safe. He had protocols for accessing properties when there were genuine welfare concerns, and my presence as a family member would help ensure everything was done properly. That should have been when I insisted on calling my mum first, or asked to see more formal identification, or just walked away entirely. But I was genuinely worried about Gran, and this seemed like the fastest way to find out if she was all right. The social worker had tools for gaining entry without causing damage, and within a few minutes we were inside Gran's house. It was immediately obvious that she hadn't been home for several days. Stale air, unopened mail, food going off in the kitchen, but the house didn't show signs of any emergency or struggle. Gran's belongings were all in their normal places. Her medication was still in the bathroom cabinet, and there were no obvious indications of what might have happened to her. The social worker seemed particularly interested in Gran's personal documents and financial paperwork. He spent considerable time looking through drawers and filing cabinets, claiming he needed to check for information about her care arrangements or emergency contacts. He also took detailed photographs of different rooms, explaining that documentation was required for welfare check reports and that the images would help other professionals assess Gran's living situation and support needs. Something about his behavior was starting to make me uncomfortable, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what seemed wrong. He was thorough and professional, asking appropriate questions about Gran's routine and health concerns. But he was also gathering much more information than seemed necessary for a basic welfare check. Personal financial documents, details about her daily schedule, even observations about security arrangements and valuable items in the house. When I suggested that we should contact police about Gran's apparent disappearance, the social worker discouraged immediate reporting. He explained that elderly people often made unexpected changes to their routines, and that filing missing person reports prematurely could cause unnecessary alarm and waste police resources. He suggested waiting another day or two to see if Gran returned home naturally, while he conducted follow-up inquiries through official channels that might locate her more efficiently than police investigations. That advice seemed reasonable at the time, but looking back, it was probably designed to delay any official involvement in Gran's disappearance while giving him time to complete whatever he was really doing in her house. I left that afternoon thinking I'd done everything possible to check on Gran's safety and that proper authorities were handling the situation through appropriate channels. But over the next few days, I started having doubts about the encounter. When I tried to contact the social services department to follow up on their welfare check, I couldn't find any record of the officer I'd met or any scheduled visits to Gran's address. The phone number on the identification he'd shown me led to a generic voicemail system that didn't identify any specific department or organization. When I tried to report my concerns to the main council office, they had no knowledge of any welfare checks being conducted in Gran's area. I realized that the man I'd helped gain entry to Gran's house probably wasn't a legitimate social worker at all. I'd assisted a stranger in conducting what was essentially a burglary, providing family authorization for someone to access property and information they had no right to examine. But understanding that I'd been deceived didn't immediately clarify what had actually happened to Gran, or why someone had wanted access to her house and personal documents. When I finally convinced my mum to report Gran as missing, the police investigation revealed that she'd been admitted to hospital several days earlier after collapsing while out shopping. When she was found, she had been unconscious and had no identification with her, which prevented the hospital from contacting her family members immediately. Gran was recovering well, but the timing meant that her house had been empty and vulnerable during exactly the period when the fake social worker had gained access with my unwitting assistance. Someone had been monitoring Gran's situation carefully enough to know when she'd be absent from her home, and had used that opportunity to conduct systematic search of her property while maintaining the pretense of official welfare concern. The detailed photographs and personal information gathering suggested they'd been looking for specific items or intelligence rather than just conducting a random burglary. They'd wanted access to Gran's financial records, personal documents, and security arrangements for reasons that went beyond simple theft. When I tried to research whether other elderly people in the area had experienced similar fake welfare checks, I found scattered reports of supposed social workers and health visitors who had gained access to properties under false pretenses. Most victims had been elderly people living alone who were dealing with health problems or family concerns that made them vulnerable to official-sounding offers of assistance and support. The fake officials were systematic and professional, using legitimate-looking identification and appropriate terminology to convince both elderly residents and family members that their visits were authorized and necessary. But the real purpose seemed to be gathering intelligence about elderly people's circumstances, financial situations, and security arrangements that could be used for subsequent criminal targeting. The operation was sophisticated enough to coordinate monitoring of individual elderly people, timing of fake welfare visits, and recruitment of unwitting accomplices like family members who could provide legitimate-seeming authorization for property access. I'd been used as cover for what was essentially organized reconnaissance against my own grandmother, providing the family presence needed to make the fake welfare check appear legitimate and authorized. But the most disturbing aspect was realizing that this was probably happening to elderly people across the region, with fake officials systematically gathering intelligence about vulnerable individuals who could be targeted for various forms of exploitation. The criminals were using people's genuine concern for elderly relatives to facilitate their own access to properties and personal information, turning family care instincts into tools for criminal targeting. Meanwhile, the intelligence they'd gathered from Gran's house was probably being used to plan future crimes against her, or being sold to other criminals who specialized in targeting elderly victims with specific vulnerabilities. I'd inadvertently provided criminals with everything they needed to systematically exploit my grandmother while thinking I was helping ensure her safety and well-being. The fake welfare check had been so convincing that I'd never questioned whether the man's authority was legitimate, and by the time I realized I'd been deceived, the damage was already done. Gran recovered fully from her hospital stay, but I never told her or my mum about the fake social worker I'd helped gain access to her house. The knowledge that I'd facilitated what was essentially preparation for crimes against my own grandmother was too disturbing to share with family members who trusted me to protect rather than endanger her. But I remained concerned about what use might eventually be made of the intelligence that had been gathered about Gran's circumstances, and whether the fake welfare check operation was continuing to target other elderly people whose families could be manipulated into providing unwitting assistance for criminal reconnaissance. The guilt about my role in facilitating the fake welfare check was compounded by the realization that I probably wouldn't recognize similar deception if it happened again, and that my willingness to trust officials seeming authority could be exploited to harm people I cared about. When Gran mentioned a few weeks later that she'd been receiving unusually persistent calls from companies offering home security services, financial advice, and healthcare products, I knew the intelligence gathered during the fake welfare check was already being used to target her for various forms of exploitation. I never should have kept those photographs. Christ knows why I thought it was a good idea at the time. Some misguided notion about evidence, I suppose, or maybe just morbid fascination. Sitting here in this travelodge in Grimsby, 3 weeks after I packed up and left everything behind, I still can't shake the image of what I found in that house. I keep telling myself I was just doing my job, that I couldn't have known what I'd stumble into. But the truth is, I should have walked away the moment I realized something wasn't right. Should have minded my own business and left well enough alone. Now I'm looking over my shoulder every time I leave this room, wondering if they know what I saw, if they're coming for me next. I work as a house clearance specialist, worked I should say, since I doubt I'll be going back to that line of business anytime soon. It's not glamorous work, clearing out the homes of people who've died with no family to deal with their possessions. Mostly, it's just sad. Rooms full of things that meant everything to someone and nothing to anyone else. But it paid well enough, especially when you factored in the occasional valuable item that the executors had missed. The call came through my usual contact at the probate office in Sheffield. Elderly gentleman had passed away, no next of kin. Fairly standard situation. The house was a Victorian terrace in Rotherham. Nothing special from the outside, but probably worth a fair bit, once it was cleared and renovated. I was to remove all personal effects and furniture, leaving the property ready for sale. I'd done dozens of similar jobs over the years, so I didn't expect anything unusual when I collected the keys and let myself into the house that Tuesday morning. Standard layout for that type of property. Narrow hallway, front room, kitchen extension at the back, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. The deceased gentleman had clearly lived alone for some time, judging by the layer of dust on everything and the general air of neglect. The downstairs was straightforward enough. The furniture was mainly comprised of inexpensive pieces that weren't worth rescuing. Kitchen cupboards full of tinned food that had expired years ago, a few pieces of old china that might fetch a few pounds at auction. There was nothing to suggest that the occupant had been anything other than an ordinary pensioner living quietly by himself. It was when I went upstairs that I started to notice things didn't quite add up. The main bedroom was sparse, just a single bed, a wardrobe with a few old clothes, and a bedside table with some reading glasses and a packet of paracetamol. But the second bedroom was different, much different. For one thing, it was clean. Not just tidy, but properly clean in a way that the rest of the house wasn't. The windows had been recently washed. The carpet looked like it had been professionally cleaned, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. The room was almost entirely empty, except for a desk against one wall and a filing cabinet in the corner. The desk had obviously been used regularly. There were wear marks on the surface, and the chair was positioned as if someone had just stepped away from it. But there was nothing on the desk itself. No computer or paperwork or personal items. Just a clean surface and a drawer that was locked. I should have left it alone. I should have included the room in my report and allowed the estate agents to handle the contents. But curiosity got the better of me, and it wasn't difficult to force the drawer open with a screwdriver from my toolkit. Inside were 3 things: a set of car keys, a mobile phone that looked fairly new, and a memory stick. The keys were for a Ford, though I hadn't seen any car parked outside the house. The phone was switched off and needed a PIN to access. But the memory stick, well, that was what changed everything. I plugged it into my laptop, telling myself I was just checking if it contained anything relevant to the estate. Maybe financial records or important documents that the executors needed to see. What I found instead were photographs, hundreds of them, all stored in carefully organized folders. At first glance, they looked like the sort of pictures anyone might take. Houses, streets, people going about their daily business. But as I scrolled through them, I started to notice disturbing patterns. The same individuals appeared in multiple photographs taken over extended periods. The same houses were documented from different angles and at different times of day. This wasn't casual photography. It was systematic surveillance. Someone had been watching specific people and properties, documenting their routines and activities with methodical precision. The folders were labeled with initials and postcodes, suggesting a filing system that covered a wide geographical area. One folder in particular caught my attention because it was labeled with a postcode I recognized, the area where I lived in Sheffield. When I opened it, my blood went cold. There were photographs of my own street, my own house, even pictures of me loading equipment into my van on what must have been recent jobs. The surveillance wasn't random. I was one of dozens of people who had been systematically observed and catalogued. The photographs showed intimate details of my daily routine, when I left for work, what time I returned home, even which neighbors I spoke to regularly. But it was the final folder that made me understand the true scope of what I was looking at. It was simply labeled completed and contained photographs of houses I'd cleared over the past 2 years. Not just exterior shots, but interior photographs taken after I'd finished my work. Someone had been following up on every job I'd done, documenting the empty properties I'd left behind. The implications were terrifying. This wasn't just surveillance, it was preparation. Someone had been using my work schedule to identify properties that would be empty and vulnerable. They knew which houses had been cleared, which ones had no family checking on them, which ones were sitting empty, waiting to be sold. I spent the rest of that day going through every file on the memory stick, trying to understand the scope of the surveillance operation. There were photographs of dozens of people across South Yorkshire and beyond. Families, elderly individuals, young professionals, all documented with the same systematic attention to detail. Some files included additional information, work schedules, holiday plans, even details about security systems and spare key locations. It was like looking at a criminal intelligence database. Except the targets were all ordinary people, living normal lives. The most disturbing discovery was a section of files that contained what looked like floor plans and property layouts. These weren't professional architectural drawings, but hand-sketched maps showing room layouts, entry points, and security vulnerabilities. Many of them corresponded to houses I recognized from the surveillance photographs. I tried to convince myself there might be an innocent explanation for what I'd found. Maybe the old man had been some sort of private investigator, or perhaps he'd worked for an insurance company doing legitimate surveillance work. But the more I examined the files, the more obvious it became that this was something much darker. The photographs were taken covertly, often through windows or from concealed positions. The subjects clearly had no idea they were being watched, and the level of detail about their personal lives went far beyond anything that would be necessary for legitimate investigation work. I decided to take the memory stick to the police, but first I wanted to copy the files as backup evidence. That's when I made the mistake of accessing the internet to upload the photographs to cloud storage. The laptop connected to an unusual network, one that required special software to access. Out of curiosity, I explored some of the websites available through this network. What I found made me realize that the surveillance operation was much larger than just one person's obsession. There were entire communities dedicated to sharing intelligence about potential targets, coordinating surveillance activities, and planning break-ins. The photographs from the memory stick weren't just evidence of one person's criminal activity. They were part of a collaborative effort involving dozens of people across different regions. The surveillance subjects had been chosen systematically, with different individuals responsible for monitoring specific areas and target types. I found discussion boards where people shared techniques for following targets without being detected, advice on photographing properties from concealed positions, even guides for identifying vulnerable individuals who lived alone or had predictable routines. But most disturbing of all were the sections dedicated to completed operations. Detailed accounts of break-ins and burglaries that had been planned using surveillance intelligence. The perpetrators treated these crimes like collaborative projects, sharing photographs of stolen items and comparing the accuracy of their intelligence gathering. I recognized several of the properties from local news reports about burglaries over the past few months. Elderly residents who'd been targeted while they were at medical appointments. Families whose homes had been ransacked while they were on holiday. even a few cases where people had been followed home and robbed in their driveways. The network wasn't just facilitating burglaries. They were also sharing information for stalking and harassment campaigns. I found files documenting systematic intimidation of individuals who had apparently done nothing more than catch the attention of someone in the surveillance network. One case file made me physically sick. A young mother in Barnsley had been subjected to months of harassment after someone in the network had identified her as a target. They documented her children's school schedules, her work routine, even the times when she was alone in the house. The harassment had escalated from anonymous phone calls to someone breaking into her garden and leaving threatening messages. The police investigation into her case had apparently stalled because the perpetrators were careful not to leave physical evidence. Everything was coordinated through the hidden network, making it almost impossible for traditional investigative methods to identify the people responsible. I realized I was looking at a new type of organized crime, one that used collaborative surveillance and online coordination to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. The old man whose house I was clearing hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a distributed network that treated crime like a collaborative hobby. The worst part was understanding how I'd been used. My work clearing deceased persons' properties had made me an unwitting intelligence asset for the network. They'd been following my movements, documenting my jobs, using my work schedule to identify empty properties that could be targeted with minimal risk. Every house I'd cleared had potentially become a target for burglary or worse. Every family I'd helped by clearing their deceased relatives' property had unknowingly been added to a surveillance database. I'd been facilitating crimes without even knowing it. I tried calling the police that evening, but explaining what I'd found was more complicated than I'd expected. The investigating officer seemed overwhelmed by the technical aspects of the hidden network and uncertain about how to proceed with evidence that had been gathered through what might be considered unauthorized access to computer systems. They took the memory stick and promised to investigate, but I got the impression that this was beyond their usual expertise. Cybercrime involving hidden networks wasn't something the local police were equipped to handle effectively. That's when I started noticing I was being watched. Cars that seemed to follow me between job sites, people who appeared in different locations but always seemed to be observing me from a distance. My house was photographed again. I found the images on the same hidden network sites I'd discovered earlier, but this time the surveillance felt different, more focused and threatening. The new photographs included close-ups of my front door, my car registration, even shots taken through my kitchen window. Someone had also accessed my personal information and posted it alongside speculation about what I might have discovered in the old man's house. The network had identified me as a threat and was now treating me as a target. Discussion threads speculated about whether I'd copied their files, whether I'd contacted the police, even whether I might need to be dealt with to prevent further exposure of their activities. I lasted 3 more days before I decided to run, packed a bag, withdrew what cash I could from my accounts, and drove to this seaside town where I hoped I could disappear for a while. Left my house, my business, even my cat with a neighbor who thinks I've gone away on holiday. But I don't think distance is going to protect me from people who've made surveillance and coordination their specialty. They've had weeks to document my habits, my relationships, my vulnerabilities. They probably know more about my life than I do. The police haven't contacted me since I gave them the memory stick, and I'm not sure they're equipped to shut down a network that operates entirely through hidden parts of the internet. These people have created a system that allows them to commit crimes with almost complete impunity, protected by technology that most law enforcement agencies don't understand. I keep thinking about all the people in those surveillance files, all the ordinary individuals who have no idea they're being watched and catalogued by criminals. Families going about their daily lives while strangers document their routines and plan ways to exploit their vulnerabilities. The old man is dead, but his network is still active, still watching, still planning, still treating other people's lives like a game where privacy doesn't matter and everyone else exists only as potential targets. Sometimes I wonder if I should have kept quiet, should have left the memory stick in that drawer and walked away from the whole thing. Maybe I'd still have my normal life, my business, my sense of security. But then I think about that young mother in Barnsley, about all the people who've been targeted because someone decided their privacy was worth less than criminal entertainment. And I know I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd done nothing. I just hope the police can make sense of what I gave them before this network claims any more victims, before they decide I'm too much of a risk to leave alone. I thought buying a refurbished laptop from a small computer shop would save me some money, but it turns out the previous owner had left more than just their old files on the hard drive. My ancient Dell had finally died after years of loyal service, and replacing it wasn't exactly in the budget. I'd been made redundant from my admin job 6 months earlier and was still looking for steady work, so spending hundreds on a new computer wasn't an option. The little repair shop on Hertford Street had a selection of refurbished machines at reasonable prices, older models that had been cleaned up and given new leases of life. The owner assured me that all personal data would be wiped from whatever I chose, though he mentioned that occasionally people found random files that the formatting process had missed. I picked a 3-year-old Lenovo that seemed perfect for my needs: word processing, job applications, basic internet browsing. Nothing fancy, but functional enough to help with my job search and personal correspondence. The laptop worked well for the first few weeks. It was noticeably faster than my old machine, and I was pleased with what seemed like a good purchase that would serve me well while I rebuilt my finances. But when I was organizing files one evening, I discovered a folder buried deep in the system directories that hadn't been deleted during the refurbishment process. It was labeled with a series of numbers and letters that didn't mean anything to me, but curiosity got the better of my common sense. Inside the folder were hundreds of documents, images, and what appeared to be correspondence files. Most seemed innocuous enough: personal letters, family photographs, financial records that belonged to someone I didn't know. But mixed in with the normal personal documents were files that made me deeply uncomfortable. Detailed profiles of various people, complete with photographs, personal information, daily routines, and what appeared to be surveillance notes documenting their activities over extended periods. The profiles weren't just casual observations. They included comprehensive intelligence about each person's vulnerabilities, relationships, financial circumstances, and behavioral patterns that could only have been gathered through systematic stalking or professional investigation. Some profiles contained information about security arrangements at people's homes and workplaces, including details about alarm systems, daily schedules, and times when properties would be unoccupied. But most disturbing were documents that appeared to be contracts or agreements related to these profiles. Financial arrangements for what were described as comprehensive disappearance services, with pricing structures based on the complexity of individual cases. I was looking at evidence of what appeared to be a systematic operation that provided services for making people vanish permanently, complete with detailed intelligence gathering and pricing for different levels of service. The previous owner of my laptop had apparently been involved in facilitating disappearances, with the accumulated files representing months or years of preparation for eliminating specific individuals who had been targeted by clients willing to pay substantial sums for these services. But understanding what I'd discovered didn't provide clear guidance about what to do with the information. I was holding evidence of potential murders or kidnappings, but the files were vague enough that proving specific crimes would be difficult without additional investigation. I tried to research some of the names mentioned in the profiles, hoping to understand whether these were real people who might be missing or in danger. What I found was disturbing. Several names corresponded to people who had been reported missing in various parts of the UK over the past 2 years, with circumstances that matched the detailed intelligence contained in the laptop files. The disappearances had been treated as voluntary departures by police, since the missing persons were adults with no obvious enemies or reasons to be targeted for violence. But the systematic intelligence gathering suggested these weren't random disappearances or people choosing to start new lives elsewhere. Someone had been systematically targeting specific individuals, gathering comprehensive intelligence about their circumstances, and then facilitating their permanent removal in ways that avoided arousing suspicion from law enforcement. The laptop files represented a professional service that specialized in making people disappear while ensuring their absence appeared voluntary or accidental rather than criminal. But the most troubling discovery was that the files included active cases, people who were apparently being assessed and prepared for disappearance services that hadn't been completed yet. Recent surveillance reports, updated intelligence, and what appeared to be final preparations for eliminating individuals who might still be unaware they'd been targeted. I was holding current evidence of planned crimes against people who could potentially be saved if I could identify them and alert appropriate authorities. But extracting actionable intelligence from the files required accessing specific platforms and communication methods that were referenced in the documents, but weren't immediately accessible through normal internet browsing. The disappearance service operated through hidden websites that required specialized access methods, with clients and service providers communicating through platforms designed to maintain anonymity and avoid law enforcement detection. When I eventually found ways to access these hidden platforms, I discovered an entire marketplace dedicated to various forms of elimination services, with the disappearance operation being just one option, among many available to people who wanted specific individuals removed from their lives permanently. The casual way these services were advertised and discussed suggested that facilitating disappearances was a routine business transaction, with professional service providers competing for clients who needed people eliminated for personal, financial, or business reasons. The laptop files weren't evidence of isolated criminal activity, but documentation of systematic services that were available to anyone willing to pay for professional elimination of problem individuals. But proving the connection between the marketplace and actual disappearances would require much more investigation than I could safely undertake on my own, especially since the people involved had demonstrated sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. Meanwhile, the active cases mentioned in the laptop files were probably proceeding toward completion, with targeted individuals continuing their normal lives unaware that they'd been systematically assessed and marked for elimination. The refurbished laptop that was supposed to help me find new employment had instead provided me with evidence of organized elimination services that were operating while maintaining complete anonymity and avoiding law enforcement detection. But reporting what I discovered would require explaining how I'd found the information, potentially making me a person of interest in criminal investigations while failing to prevent ongoing crimes against people whose elimination had already been contracted and paid for. I eventually contacted police through an anonymous tip line, providing general information about the disappearance service without revealing how I'd learned about their activities or identifying specific individuals who might be targeted. But I remained concerned about the active cases that were probably still proceeding, and about the possibility that the people operating these elimination services might attempt to recover the laptop files I discovered. The computer shop where I'd purchased the refurbished machine claimed to have no information about the previous owner, and the files themselves contained no identifying details that could be traced back to specific individuals or organizations. The elimination service was probably continuing to operate while recruiting new clients and targeting additional people for disappearance, using methods that had been refined through years of successful operations that had avoided law enforcement detection. When I finally replaced the refurbished laptop with a different machine, I destroyed the hard drive completely, but I never stopped wondering whether the people in those active case files had managed to avoid the elimination services that had been contracted against them, or whether they'd simply joined the growing list of individuals who had disappeared without explanation or accountability. The lecture notes on the USB stick I discovered in the university library weren't from any course I'd ever heard of. I was hunting for a power socket in the back corner of the university library when I spotted it plugged into an outlet behind one of the desks. Someone had obviously been charging it and forgotten to take it with them when they left. Happens all the time. Students are constantly losing phones, chargers, and memory sticks around campus. I unplugged it thinking I'd hand it in at the front desk, but curiosity got the better of me first. The stick was unlabeled and looked fairly new, so I figured I'd have a quick look to see if there were any files that might help identify the owner. Maybe a name in a document or assignment header that would let me return it directly. When I plugged it into my laptop, the drive contained several folders organized by what appeared to be academic subjects: psychology, sociology, medicine, standard university course materials. But when I opened the psychology folder, the content wasn't anything I recognized from the curriculum. The files were lecture notes and research papers, but the topics were disturbing. Documents about psychological manipulation techniques, studies on breaking down mental resistance, even what appeared to be instruction manuals for inducing specific types of trauma responses in test subjects. I assumed it must be postgraduate research materials, maybe someone studying forensic psychology or criminal behavior analysis. Dark topics, but legitimate academic subjects that would require understanding how psychological harm was inflicted in order to treat or prevent it. But as I looked through more files, the content became increasingly practical and detailed. Not theoretical analysis of psychological manipulation, but step-by-step guides for actually implementing these techniques against real people. The sociology folder contained similar material focused on social isolation tactics, methods for cutting people off from support systems, and strategies for making individuals dependent on specific handlers or controllers. Again, presented in academic language, but with practical applications that seemed designed for actual use rather than theoretical study. Most disturbing was the medicine folder, which contained detailed information about pharmaceutical compounds that could be administered without detection, dosage calculations for different body weights, and instructions for recognizing and managing various types of drug-induced behavioral changes. The documents were professionally written and extensively referenced, but they read more like training manuals for criminal activities than legitimate academic research. Someone had compiled comprehensive guides for psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation disguised as university study materials. I started checking the file properties and metadata to understand more about where these documents had come from and who might have created them. Most showed creation dates within the past few months, and several contained revision histories suggesting they were actively maintained and updated. But there were no identifying details about the author or institution. The files were carefully sanitized to remove any information that might trace them back to specific individuals or organizations. When I tried to research some of the reference studies and publications mentioned in the documents, I found that while many were real academic papers, they were being cited in ways that distorted their original findings and conclusions. Legitimate research about trauma recovery was being misrepresented to support techniques for inflicting psychological damage. Medical studies about pharmaceutical effects were being reframed as instructions for drugging people without consent. Academic work was being systematically corrupted to create guides for criminal activity. The USB drive wasn't just study material someone had forgotten. It was a comprehensive training curriculum for people learning to manipulate, control, and harm others using supposedly scientific methods. But I had no idea whether the person who'd lost it was a student researching these topics for legitimate academic purposes, or someone actively involved in activities that required this type of specialized knowledge. The location where I'd found the drive didn't provide any obvious clues. That section of the library was used by students from multiple departments, and anyone could have been working there and accidentally left the USB stick behind. I considered reporting the find to university security or police, but explaining the content would require admitting that I'd accessed files that might be evidence of criminal activity. Without knowing whether the materials were connected to ongoing crimes or just disturbing academic research, reporting them might create problems for innocent people while failing to prevent actual harm. But keeping the drive felt equally problematic. If the materials were being used to plan or commit serious crimes against real victims, failing to report them might mean allowing preventable harm to continue. I decided to research whether similar training materials were available through other sources, hoping to understand whether this was an isolated collection or part of a larger pattern of criminal instruction sharing. That research led me to hidden websites that specialized in providing exactly these types of educational resources. Comprehensive training programs for people who wanted to learn psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation techniques. The materials on the USB drive weren't unique. They were part of systematic educational offerings designed to train people in methods for harming others while avoiding detection or accountability. The courses were professionally structured and extensively detailed, covering everything from basic psychological pressure tactics to advanced pharmaceutical manipulation. Students could progress through different skill levels, receive updated materials, and even access practical training opportunities. Most disturbing was that the program specifically targeted university students and recent graduates, recruiting people who had academic backgrounds that would make them effective at applying psychological and medical knowledge for criminal purposes. The training wasn't just theoretical. It included practical assignments where students were expected to test techniques on real people and report back on the effectiveness of different approaches. I realized that whoever had lost the USB drive was probably participating in an organized criminal training program that was systematically teaching people to harm others using supposedly scientific methods. But the educational materials were just one part of a larger operation that included practical application opportunities. Students who completed the training programs were connected with people who could provide targets for practicing their newly acquired skills. The psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation techniques weren't being taught for academic interest. They were professional development for people planning to participate in serious crimes against vulnerable victims. The university environment provided perfect cover for this type of criminal education. Students regularly accessed disturbing academic content, participated in psychological research, and studied medical topics that would seem suspicious in other contexts. People learning to manipulate and harm others could blend seamlessly into legitimate academic communities while developing skills that would eventually be used against innocent people who had no idea they were being systematically targeted. But identifying specific participants in these training programs would be nearly impossible without inside knowledge of the recruitment and education processes. The materials were designed to be shared discreetly among trusted individuals who had demonstrated commitment to the criminal applications. Meanwhile, the training programs were probably continuing to recruit new students and develop increasingly sophisticated methods for psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation that could be used against growing numbers of victims. The USB drive I'd found was evidence of systematic criminal education that was almost certainly being used to facilitate ongoing harm against people who had no idea they were being targeted by individuals with specialized training in exploitation techniques. But proving the connection between the educational materials and specific crimes would require much more comprehensive investigation than I could undertake safely on my own. I never returned the USB drive to the library or attempted to identify its owner. Instead, I destroyed it and tried to forget about the disturbing training materials I'd discovered. But the knowledge that such comprehensive criminal education was being conducted through apparently legitimate academic channels made me constantly aware of how vulnerable everyone was to manipulation by people who had learned to weaponize psychological and medical knowledge against unsuspecting victims. The week after I'd destroyed the drive, I noticed someone had been asking around the library about a lost USB stick, providing descriptions that matched exactly what I'd found and offering a substantial reward for its return. I should have realized something was wrong when they offered to pay me £60 an hour to look after children I was never actually allowed to meet. The job advertisement appeared on a local parenting website where I'd been looking for childminding work around Nottingham. After months of unemployment following redundancy from the call centre, I was desperate for any income and had decided to try childcare since I'd always got on well with my sister's kids. The listing was different from typical childminding adverts. Instead of describing specific children and their needs, it mentioned providing care services for multiple families who required flexible arrangements and absolute discretion. The pay rate was extraordinary, 3 times what other childminding jobs offered. But the hours were irregular and the duties weren't clearly defined. When I applied, the response came from someone calling themselves the Family Services Coordinator, who explained that they managed childcare arrangements for several professional families who had complex scheduling requirements and privacy concerns. They wanted to meet me at a cafe in the city centre to discuss the role and assess my suitability for what they described as specialised childcare services. The interview process would be thorough, they warned, because the families they worked with required absolute reliability and discretion from their childcare providers. The interview was unlike any job meeting I'd ever experienced. Instead of discussing my experience with children or asking for references, the coordinator focused entirely on my personal circumstances, financial situation, and availability for immediate deployment to various locations around the East Midlands. They seemed particularly interested in whether I had close family members who might ask questions about my work. if I minded traveling to unfamiliar locations at short notice, and how I felt about maintaining complete confidentiality about client families and their arrangements. When I asked to learn more about the specific children I'd be caring for, the coordinator explained that client families valued their privacy so highly that childcare providers weren't given detailed information about individual children until they arrived at each assignment. This approach protected the families' identities while ensuring that childcare providers remained focused on professional service delivery rather than becoming personally involved with the children and their circumstances. The arrangement seemed unusual, but not necessarily inappropriate. Wealthy families often had legitimate reasons for wanting privacy and security around their childcare arrangements, especially if they were prominent in business or politics. I was offered the position immediately, with the first assignment scheduled for the following week. I'd be collected by car and taken to a private address where I'd provide childcare services for an unspecified number of children during daytime hours. The payment would be in cash at the end of each assignment, and I'd be provided with emergency contacts and basic instructions once I arrived at each location. On the morning of my first assignment, a black car arrived at my address exactly on time. The driver was professional but uncommunicative, explaining only that the journey would take about an hour and that I should avoid asking questions about the destination or the families we'd be visiting. We drove to a large detached house in what appeared to be an expensive rural area outside Nottingham. The property was surrounded by high fences and had security features that seemed excessive for a normal family home. When we arrived, I was met by a woman who introduced herself as the house supervisor. She provided me with basic instructions about meal times, safety procedures, and contact protocols, but still didn't give me any information about the specific children I'd be caring for. The house was beautifully furnished but felt strangely impersonal, more like a high-end hotel than a family home. There were no personal photographs, children's artwork, or other signs of normal family life that you'd expect in a house where children lived regularly. When I asked to meet the children I'd be supervising, the supervisor explained that they were still sleeping and that I should familiarize myself with the house layout and emergency procedures before they woke up. But as the morning progressed, no children appeared. The supervisor kept explaining that they were having breakfast in their rooms, or were occupied with educational activities, or were resting between scheduled activities. By midday, I'd been in the house for several hours without seeing any evidence that children were actually present. No sounds of playing or talking, no meals being prepared for young people, no toys or games being used anywhere in the property. When I expressed concern about not having met the children I was supposed to be caring for, the supervisor became evasive and suggested that my role might be different from what I'd initially understood. She explained that some childcare assignments involved being available for children who might need supervision, rather than actively caring for children who were currently present. Families paid for childcare providers to be on standby in case their arrangements changed unexpectedly, but the explanation didn't address why I'd been brought to a specific house and given detailed instructions about caring for children who apparently weren't there. I started to suspect that the child-minding job wasn't legitimate at all, but was cover for some other type of arrangement that required having unvetted adults present in private properties for reasons that had nothing to do with childcare. The house might be used for activities that required having people with plausible explanations for being present if law enforcement or other authorities became interested in what was happening at the property. When I tried to leave the house to get some fresh air, I discovered that the doors were locked and I couldn't exit the property without assistance from the supervisor. She explained that security protocols required all visitors to remain accompanied while on the premises. I realized I was essentially being held at the property against my will, under the pretense of providing childcare services that clearly didn't exist. The child-minding job was a recruitment method for getting people into controlled environments where they could be monitored, assessed, or used for purposes they hadn't consented to participate in. But understanding what was happening didn't provide any immediate way to extract myself safely from the situation. The supervisor clearly had instructions about managing my presence at the property, and the security measures suggested this was a planned operation rather than a spontaneous deception. When I insisted on being taken home immediately, the supervisor became less accommodating and explained that leaving before the scheduled end of the assignment would result in forfeiture of payment and potential legal consequences for breach of contract. She also mentioned that my personal details and financial circumstances were now part of their client records, and that premature departure might be interpreted as evidence of unreliability that could affect my future employment prospects. The implications were clear. I was being coerced into remaining at the property through a combination of financial pressure and implied threats about consequences of non-cooperation. But the most disturbing aspect was realizing that other people had probably been recruited through similar fake child-minding opportunities and might currently be held at other properties under the same false pretenses. The operation was systematic and sophisticated, using legitimate-seeming employment opportunities to recruit people who could be controlled and exploited while believing they were providing genuine childcare services. People who were financially desperate and socially isolated were being targeted specifically because they were less likely to question unusual arrangements or have family members who would investigate if they failed to return home as expected. The fake child-minding service was probably one part of a larger operation that used various types of employment fraud to recruit people for activities they would never have agreed to participate in voluntarily. But proving what was happening would require escaping from the controlled environment and providing evidence that would be difficult to gather while being monitored and confined. Meanwhile, the recruitment process was probably continuing, with new job advertisements targeting other desperate people who needed income and would be willing to accept unusual employment arrangements that seemed too good to question thoroughly. The child-minding opportunity that had seemed like a solution to my financial problems had instead made me a victim of systematic deception and possible trafficking, with no clear way to escape or seek help without risking serious consequences. When the supervisor finally mentioned that evening arrangements might require additional services that hadn't been discussed during the initial interview, I knew the childcare pretense was about to be abandoned entirely. I keep telling myself I should have just thrown that photo album away the moment I realized the pictures weren't from any holiday I'd ever taken. My mum died suddenly last March, and I've been slowly working through the process of sorting her belongings from the house in Blackpool, where she'd lived alone for the past decade. Most of it has been straightforward, if emotionally difficult. Clothes for charity shops, furniture that relatives might want, the usual accumulation of a lifetime that needs to be dealt with when someone passes away. But tucked away in a drawer in her bedroom, I found a photo album I'd never seen before. It was the old-fashioned kind with sticky pages and plastic covers, filled with what appeared to be holiday photographs from various trips and outings. At first glance, the photos seemed normal enough. Pictures of tourist attractions, countryside views, seaside promenades, the sort of snapshots that any pensioner might take during day trips or holidays. But as I looked more carefully, I started noticing details that didn't make sense. The photos showed places I recognized: York Minster, the Lake District, Brighton Pier. But they also showed me in these locations, apparently taken during visits I'd never made. There I was, standing in front of landmarks I'd never seen, wearing clothes I didn't remember owning, sometimes with people I didn't recognize. The strangest part was how natural and unposed I looked in these photographs, not like someone who was aware they were being photographed, but like candid shots taken during genuine leisure activities. But I had no memory of being in any of these places or doing the activities the photos showed. Initially, I wondered if I was looking at pictures of someone who resembled me closely. Maybe Mum had befriended someone who looked similar. Or perhaps there were family members I didn't know about who shared physical characteristics. But the person in the photographs was definitely me. Same height, same build, same distinctive scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. These weren't pictures of someone who looked like me. They were pictures of me in places I'd never been. I tried to think of rational explanations. Maybe I'd forgotten about family trips from years ago, or perhaps these were photos from events I'd attended but hadn't paid much attention to. Memory can be unreliable, especially when it comes to routine outings that didn't seem significant at the time. But some of the photographs showed me in recent clothing and with a hairstyle I'd only adopted within the past 2 years. These weren't forgotten memories from decades past. They were apparently recent photos of activities I should definitely remember participating in. The implications were deeply unsettling. Either I was experiencing serious memory problems that were affecting my ability to recall significant portions of my recent life, or someone had been systematically photographing me without my knowledge during activities I wasn't aware I was participating in. I decided to research the locations shown in the photographs, hoping to find some trigger that might help me remember when and why I might have visited these places. When I started looking into some of the more distinctive backgrounds visible in the photos, I found references to locations that were connected to websites and services I'd never encountered before. Following these connections led me to platforms that seemed to exist outside normal internet browsing, places where people shared and traded photographs that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. The platforms contained thousands of images showing ordinary people in various locations and activities, with detailed information about when and where the photographs had been taken. Most disturbing was that many subjects appeared to be unaware they were being photographed, captured during routine activities they probably assumed were private. Some photos were clearly taken from significant distances using telephoto lenses, while others appeared to have been captured during social situations where the subjects might have expected to be photographed but weren't aware of the specific images being taken. But what made me feel sick was finding additional photographs of myself among these collections. Images that weren't in Mum's album, but showed me during routine daily activities around my home area in Lancaster. Pictures of me walking to work, shopping for groceries, even sitting in my garden reading a book. All taken without my knowledge, from positions where the photographer would have been invisible to me, while I was going about my normal business. I realized that someone had been systematically surveilling and photographing me for an extended period, documenting both my routine activities and what appeared to be staged situations where I'd been unknowingly directed to specific locations for more elaborate photography sessions. The holiday photos in Mum's album weren't documenting trips I'd forgotten about. They were evidence that I'd been deliberately taken to various locations while unconscious or otherwise unaware, then photographed in ways that made these situations appear to be normal leisure activities. But understanding what had happened didn't immediately clarify who had been responsible or what methods they'd used to transport me to these locations without my knowledge or memory. The sophistication required to drug someone repeatedly, transport them to distant locations, photograph them in apparently natural poses, and return them home without leaving any conscious memory of these events suggested professional-level planning and resources. When I tried to research whether other people had experienced similar systematic photography and memory loss, I found scattered reports of individuals who'd discovered photographs of themselves in locations they couldn't remember visiting. Most had initially assumed they were experiencing memory problems or psychological issues, but investigation eventually revealed that they'd been targeted by operations that specialized in systematic surveillance and manipulation for purposes that weren't immediately clear to the victims. The operations seemed to focus on creating comprehensive photographic records of people's lives, including both routine activities and staged situations that required sophisticated planning and execution. But the most disturbing aspect was that many victims never discovered the full extent of their surveillance, only becoming aware when they accidentally encountered photographs that had been taken without their knowledge. The hidden platforms where these photos were traded contained much larger collections than what individual victims had discovered, suggesting that systematic surveillance and photography was happening to many more people than realized they were being documented. I was probably just one of many people who were being systematically photographed and surveilled, with most never becoming aware of the extent to which their lives were being documented and distributed through networks they couldn't access or monitor. The photo album I'd found in Mum's belongings had probably been placed there deliberately, possibly as part of whatever psychological manipulation was being conducted against me through this systematic surveillance. But proving what was happening would require evidence that was difficult to gather safely, since the people responsible had clearly demonstrated sophisticated capabilities for conducting surveillance while avoiding detection. Meanwhile, the photography and surveillance was probably continuing, with new images being captured regularly and added to collections that were traded through platforms designed to maintain anonymity and avoid law enforcement oversight. I never found any explanation for how Mum had obtained the photo album, or whether she'd been aware of the surveillance operation that was apparently targeting me. But I remained constantly aware that my daily activities were probably being photographed and documented by people whose purposes I couldn't understand and whose methods I couldn't detect or prevent. Every routine activity now felt potentially dangerous, knowing that people with sophisticated surveillance capabilities were systematically documenting my life while maintaining the ability to manipulate my memory and consciousness in ways that left no trace I could reliably detect. The photo album that was supposed to provide memories of Mum's life had instead revealed that my own life was being systematically documented and manipulated by people whose identity and motivations remained completely unknown to me. I'm still not sure I should be telling anyone this, and I keep going back and forth about whether I imagined the whole thing, or if it was as bad as I think it was. It started with an email that clearly wasn't meant for me. I work in accounts for a small manufacturing company in Preston. Nothing exciting, just processing invoices and keeping track of payments. Most of my day involves opening emails from suppliers and customers, so when I got a message with no clear sender information, I assumed it was another routine business inquiry. The email contained what appeared to be a shopping list, but not for anything you'd buy at a normal shop. I didn't recognize the clinical names of the items, the quantities seemed unusually precise, and the delivery instructions were significantly more detailed than what one would anticipate for everyday purchases. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam or had been sent to the wrong address by mistake. But something about the precision of the list made me curious about what these items actually were and why someone needed them in such specific quantities. When I searched for some of the item names online, I found they were specialized medical supplies and pharmaceutical compounds, that weren't available through normal retail channels. The sort of things that would typically require professional licensing or medical supervision to obtain legally. But the email wasn't from any medical facility or legitimate healthcare provider. The sender information was minimal, and the delivery instructions seemed designed to maintain anonymity rather than ensure proper handling of what appeared to be controlled substances. I started to suspect that I'd accidentally received someone's order for illegal drugs or medical supplies, possibly intended for activities that couldn't be conducted through legitimate channels. The responsible thing would have been to delete the email and forget about it. But I found myself researching the items more thoroughly, trying to understand what they were used for and why someone would need them outside of proper medical supervision. What I discovered made me deeply uncomfortable. Several of the compounds could be used to incapacitate people without their knowledge, while others were designed for medical procedures that would be extremely dangerous if performed by unqualified individuals. The shopping list wasn't for legitimate medical supplies. It was an order for materials that could be used to drug, restrain, or perform unauthorized medical procedures on unwilling victims. But understanding what the email contained didn't provide clear guidance about what I should do with the information. I had no way of knowing who had sent it, who was supposed to receive it, or whether anyone was in immediate danger from these materials being obtained and used. I tried to trace the email back to its source, hoping to understand more about who might be ordering these dangerous supplies and what they planned to do with them. That research led me to websites I'd never seen before, platforms that required specific access methods and seemed to exist outside normal internet browsing, places where people could order various types of restricted materials and services that weren't available through legitimate channels. The platforms contained extensive catalogs of medical supplies, pharmaceutical compounds, and equipment that could be obtained without the usual verification and oversight that legitimate suppliers would require. But mixed in with items that might have legitimate uses were products that were clearly intended for harmful purposes. Substances for incapacitating people, equipment for restraining victims, even instructional materials for performing procedures that no qualified medical professional would attempt outside proper facilities. The email I'd received wasn't an isolated transaction, but part of systematic commerce in materials that could be used to harm people in ways that would be difficult for law enforcement to detect or prosecute. The casual way these items were advertised and sold suggested that systematic harm against unwilling victims was routine business for people who understood how to access these hidden marketplaces. But the most disturbing discovery was that the platforms weren't just selling physical items. They also facilitated services where people could arrange for others to be targeted using the same dangerous materials and techniques. Clients could commission systematic drugging, restraint, or medical procedures against specific individuals. With service providers who specialized in using the ordered materials against victims who would never know they were being systematically harmed. I realized that the email I'd received might have been connected to ongoing crimes against real people, with the medical supplies being used to facilitate activities that range from systematic poisoning to unauthorized medical procedures. But proving this connection would require much more investigation than I could safely undertake, especially since the people involved had clearly developed sophisticated methods for maintaining anonymity and avoiding law enforcement detection. Meanwhile, similar orders were probably being processed regularly, with dangerous materials being distributed to people who planned to use them against unwilling victims in ways that would be extremely difficult to trace or prevent. The wrong email that had seemed like a simple delivery mistake had instead provided insight into systematic criminal commerce that facilitated ongoing harm against people who had no idea they were being targeted. but reporting what I'd discovered would require explaining how I'd learned about these illegal marketplaces, potentially making me appear complicit in criminal activities, while failing to provide specific information about individual victims or perpetrators. The email order had probably been rerouted to a different address by this point, with the dangerous materials being delivered to their intended recipient, who could use them for whatever harmful purposes they'd originally planned. I never received any follow-up emails or communications related to the original message, suggesting that the sender had realized their mistake and taken steps to ensure their future orders wouldn't be misdirected to innocent recipients. But I remained disturbed by the knowledge that these marketplaces existed and were probably continuing to facilitate systematic harm against victims who would never understand what was being done to them or why they were experiencing unexplained health problems or behavioral changes. Every time I felt unwell or experienced symptoms I couldn't explain, I found myself wondering whether someone might have access to the same materials I'd seen advertised through those hidden platforms, and whether my own food, drinks, or environment might have been compromised by people who understood how to obtain and use dangerous substances without detection. The business email system that was supposed to help me process routine invoices and correspondence had instead made me aware of criminal commerce that operated parallel to legitimate business, using similar communication methods to coordinate activities that cause systematic harm to people who never knew they were being targeted. When I eventually changed jobs and moved to a different company, I made sure to use completely new email addresses and avoided any online activities that might lead me back to the platforms I discovered through that accidental message. But the knowledge that such systematic criminal commerce existed made every interaction with strangers feel potentially dangerous, knowing that people who appeared completely normal might have access to materials and services that could be used to cause harm in ways that would be nearly impossible to detect or prove. I'd always been bad at languages despite studying French for years at school. By the time I got to university, I could read fairly well and understood most of what I heard, but speaking was still a nightmare. That horrible combination of knowing exactly what you want to say, but being too self-conscious about pronunciation and grammar to actually get the words out. My course required a year abroad, which meant I needed to be conversational in French by the following September or risk failing my degree entirely. The University Language Center offered conversation classes, but they were always oversubscribed and moved too slowly for someone who needed intensive practice. Private tutoring was expensive, and most of the French students I knew were more interested in practicing their English than helping struggling Brits with pronunciation. That's when someone mentioned online language exchange platforms where you could practice conversation with native speakers for free. The concept was simple. You'd spend half your session helping someone practice English, and they'd spend the other half helping you with French. Mutual benefit without the cost of formal tutoring. I found several platforms that offered this kind of language exchange, most of them operating through standard video calling software with simple matching systems based on your language learning goals and availability. The more established sites had thousands of users and sophisticated systems for matching people with compatible learning objectives. But the platform I eventually chose specialized in what they called intensive language immersion for students who needed rapid improvement. They claimed to use advanced matching algorithms that paired learners with native speakers who had specific expertise in helping people overcome particular language barriers. The registration process was more detailed than I'd expected for a language learning platform. Beyond the basic information about my French ability and learning goals, They wanted comprehensive details about my background, daily routine, and personal circumstances. They explained that this information helped them match people with compatible schedules and similar life experiences. The level of personal detail they requested was extensive. Where I lived, what I studied, my family background, even information about my social activities and hobbies. When I questioned why this was necessary for language learning, they explained that successful conversation practice required understanding cultural context and shared experiences that could serve as discussion topics. Within a few days, I was matched with a French speaker called Marie, who claimed to be a university student in Lyon, looking to improve her English conversation skills. Her profile indicated she was studying similar subjects to me and had comparable language learning challenges, suggesting we'd be well suited for mutual practice sessions. Our first conversation went reasonably well. Marie was patient with my pronunciation mistakes and provided helpful corrections without being condescending. She seemed genuinely interested in practicing English and asked thoughtful questions about British university life and cultural differences between our countries. But I noticed that Marie was particularly interested in details about my personal life that seemed tangential to language practice. She wanted to know about my daily schedule, where I lived, what my accommodation was like, and how I spent my free time. When I redirected the conversation to more general topics, she seemed disappointed and struggled to maintain interest in the discussion. Over the next few sessions, this pattern became more pronounced. Marie would ask increasingly specific questions about my routine, my living situation, and my personal relationships. She wanted to know when I was typically alone, whether I lived with other students, and how often my family visited or called. When I tried to focus on structured language exercises or discussion of academic topics, Marie seemed distracted and would quickly steer the conversation back to personal questions about my circumstances and daily activities. I started to suspect that Marie wasn't genuinely interested in language exchange at all. Her English was actually quite fluent, much better than she'd initially suggested, and her questions seemed designed to gather information rather than practice conversation skills. More concerning was that Marie seemed to know details about my life that I hadn't shared during our conversations. She made references to places I'd visited, people I'd mentioned in passing, and even changes to my schedule that I was certain I hadn't discussed with her. When I asked how she knew these details, Marie claimed she had good memory for the personal information people shared during conversations. But I started keeping notes of what I'd actually told her, and it became clear that she was demonstrating knowledge that could only have come from systematic monitoring of my activities. I decided to research the language exchange platform more thoroughly, looking for information about their matching process and data protection policies. What I found raised serious concerns about the legitimacy of their operation. The platform claimed to be based in Switzerland and registered as an educational service provider, but the business registration details were minimal and didn't include verifiable contact information. Their terms of service were vague about how personal data was collected, stored, and shared with other users. Most concerning was the discovery that many users had similar experiences to mine. Language exchange partners who seemed more interested in gathering personal information than practicing conversation, and who demonstrated knowledge about users' lives that couldn't have been obtained through normal conversation. Some users reported that their supposed language partners had tried to arrange in-person meetings, claiming they were visiting the UK and wanted to practice English in real-world situations. Others had received unsolicited contact from their partners outside the platform, including phone calls and messages to personal accounts they'd never shared. The pattern suggested that the language exchange platform was being used as a cover for systematic data collection about vulnerable young people. particularly international students, and others who might be isolated or seeking social connections. I tried to research Marie's background more thoroughly, using the information she'd provided in her profile to verify her identity and location. What I found was troubling. There was no evidence that Marie was a real person at all. The university she claimed to attend had no record of students matching her description. The photos in her profile appeared to be stock images rather than genuine personal photographs. Even her supposed social media accounts were recently created and contained minimal genuine content. Marie was a completely fabricated identity, created specifically to interact with language learners and gather information about their personal circumstances. I realized that I'd been providing detailed information about my life, routine, and vulnerability to someone whose identity and motives were completely unknown to me. But ending contact with Marie wasn't straightforward. When I stopped scheduling conversation sessions, she began contacting me through other channels, claiming concern about my language learning progress and offering alternative ways to continue our practice sessions. She suggested meeting in person when she visited the UK, or continuing conversations through private messaging apps that would provide better audio quality than the platform's built-in system. When I declined these suggestions, she seemed genuinely distressed and insisted that abandoning our language exchange would significantly harm both of our learning objectives. Her persistence in maintaining contact seemed excessive for someone who was supposedly just disappointed about losing a conversation partner. It felt more like someone who was concerned about losing access to information they'd been systematically collecting. I started monitoring whether my personal information was appearing in unexpected places online, concerned that details I'd shared with Marie might be used for identity theft or other fraudulent purposes. What I found was evidence that information about my circumstances was being traded through hidden marketplaces that specialized in data about students and young people. Personal details, daily routines, and contact information were being sold to buyers who weren't identified but were presumably planning to use the data for criminal purposes. Some of the information being traded was specific enough that it could only have come from the detailed conversations I'd had with Marie during our supposed language exchange sessions. I wasn't just a victim of data theft. I was part of a systematic operation that used language learning as a pretext for gathering intelligence about vulnerable young people who could be targeted for various types of exploitation. The language exchange platform was essentially a recruitment tool for identifying isolated students who were seeking social connections and might be susceptible to manipulation or fraud. I tried to research other users who might have been similarly targeted, hoping to warn them about what was happening and gather evidence that could be used to expose the operation. But contacting other users was difficult because the platform didn't provide direct communication between participants beyond their scheduled language exchange sessions. I could only reach people who happened to be online at the same time I was, and most seemed reluctant to discuss their experiences with platform security or data protection. The few users I managed to speak with confirmed that they'd had similar experiences with language partners who seemed more interested in personal information than conversation practice. But most hadn't realized the full scope of what was happening and were shocked to learn that their personal details might be traded through criminal marketplaces. Some users had already experienced problems that might be connected to their participation in the language exchange program. Identity theft, unauthorized use of personal information, even stalking incidents that had started shortly after they'd shared details about their circumstances with supposed conversation partners. But proving the connection between the language platform and subsequent criminal activity was difficult. The time delays between initial data collection and eventual misuse meant that most victims didn't recognize the relationship between their language learning activities and later problems. I decided to document everything I could about the platform's operations and the information gathering techniques used by fake language partners like Marie. This investigation revealed that the operation was much more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. The platform hosted hundreds of fake profiles representing language learners from various countries, all designed to appeal to different types of users and extract different kinds of personal information. Some fake profiles targeted business students and gathered information about career prospects and financial circumstances. Others focused on international students and collected details about visa status, family connections, and social isolation that might make them vulnerable to exploitation. The most disturbing profiles seemed designed to target people dealing with mental health problems, relationship difficulties, or other personal challenges that might make them especially susceptible to manipulation and control. All of this information was being systematically collected, organized, and distributed through networks that specialized in facilitating crimes against vulnerable young people. The language exchange concept was just one of many methods being used to identify and profile potential victims of serious criminal activity. But exposing what I'd discovered wasn't straightforward. Reporting the platform to law enforcement would require admitting that I'd voluntarily shared personal information with strangers online, potentially making me appear naive or careless, rather than victimized. More importantly, taking action against the platform might alert the criminals operating it that their methods had been discovered, causing them to modify their techniques or target new populations before their existing victims could be protected. I was also concerned about my own safety. If the people behind the platform realized that I'd identified their criminal purpose and was gathering evidence against them, they might decide that I posed a security risk that needed to be eliminated. The personal information I'd shared with Marie would make it easy for them to monitor my activities and take action against me if they decided I was a threat to their operations. Meanwhile, Marie continued trying to maintain contact, sending increasingly concerned messages about my absence from scheduled conversation sessions. She claimed to be worried about my well-being and offered various types of support that seemed designed to re-establish regular communication. Her messages demonstrated detailed knowledge of my university schedule, social activities, and personal relationships that she couldn't have obtained through our previous conversations. Someone was clearly conducting comprehensive surveillance of my daily life. Most disturbing were messages that included information about my family members and friends, suggesting that the data collection operation had expanded beyond just targeting me to include people in my social network. Marie claimed that she'd learned this information through mutual connections in the language learning community, but the level of detail suggested systematic research into my personal relationships and background. I realized that everyone connected to me might be at risk of being targeted by criminals who specialized in exploiting personal information for financial fraud, identity theft, or worse. The language exchange platform had provided them with everything they needed to systematically compromise the security and privacy of everyone in my social circle. I tried to warn friends and family members about the potential risks, but explaining the situation without sounding paranoid or delusional was challenging. Most people found it difficult to believe that language learning websites could be covers for serious criminal operations. Some friends suggested that I was overreacting to what was probably just aggressive marketing by language learning companies, trying to retain customers. Others thought I might be misinterpreting cultural differences in communication styles between French and British language learners. But the evidence of systematic data collection and distribution was too comprehensive to dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. I started monitoring hidden marketplaces more systematically, documenting how personal information was being traded and looking for evidence of the criminal activities that this data was being used to facilitate. What I found was a comprehensive criminal economy built around exploiting personal information obtained from vulnerable young people through various deceptive schemes. Language learning platforms were just one method among many being used to gather intelligence about potential victims. Similar operations used fake dating profiles, fraudulent employment opportunities, bogus charity work, and various other pretexts to establish relationships with isolated or vulnerable individuals. All of these schemes shared the same basic methodology: identify people who were seeking social connections or opportunities, establish trust through seemingly legitimate interactions, then systematically extract personal information that could be used for criminal purposes. The scale of the operation suggested that thousands of young people were being targeted simultaneously through multiple platforms and schemes, creating a vast database of personal information that could be used to facilitate identity theft, fraud, stalking, and more serious crimes. But most victims never realized they were being targeted because the initial contact seemed legitimate, and the eventual misuse of their information was delayed and difficult to trace back to the original data collection. The language exchange platform was still operating when I last checked, continuing to match unsuspecting language learners with fake conversation partners who were systematically gathering information about their personal lives and circumstances. Marie was probably still conducting conversation sessions with new victims, collecting details about their routines, relationships, and vulnerabilities that would eventually be used to facilitate crimes against them. And somewhere in hidden marketplaces, detailed profiles of hundreds of students and young people were being bought and sold by criminals who specialized in turning personal information into opportunities for exploitation and harm. The conversation practice I thought would help me improve my French had instead made me part of a criminal network that systematically targeted vulnerable people for some of the most serious crimes imaginable. But the most terrifying part was knowing that I'd voluntarily provided most of the information that put me at risk, thinking I was just having friendly conversations with someone who shared my interest in language learning. The people operating these schemes understood exactly how to exploit normal human desires for social connection and self-improvement, turning our most positive impulses into vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited for criminal gain. And they were probably developing new methods and platforms all the time, finding increasingly sophisticated ways to identify and target people who were seeking help, friendship, or opportunities for personal growth. The next time someone offers to help you learn something new or make social connections online, you might want to ask yourself what they're really hoping to learn about you. I probably should have minded my own business when I noticed that our bin collection was happening on the wrong day. But once you start questioning things like that, you end up discovering answers you really didn't want to know. It was a Tuesday morning in November when I spotted the bin lorry working its way down our street. Nothing unusual about that, except our bins are normally collected on Thursdays, and had been for the 3 years I'd lived in this house. I only noticed because I'd forgotten to put mine out and was annoyed with myself for missing collection day. But when I looked outside, all the bins were still there from Monday night, exactly where people had left them. The lorry wasn't collecting refuse at all. The crew were photographing the contents of each bin, taking detailed pictures of what people had thrown away before moving on to the next house. I watched from my kitchen window as they worked systematically down the street, spending several minutes at each property documenting whatever was visible in the bins. They had proper equipment for the job, high-quality cameras, clipboards for notes, even what looked like evidence bags for collecting specific items. At first, I assumed this was some kind of council initiative. Maybe they were conducting waste audits to improve recycling rates, or gathering data about household disposal habits for environmental planning. Local authorities do all sorts of surveys that residents never hear about until the results are published. But something about the way they worked seemed too thorough and secretive for routine council business. They were careful to avoid being seen by residents, working quickly when people appeared at windows, and clearly trying to complete their documentation without attracting attention. When I tried calling the council to ask about waste monitoring programs in our area, they had no knowledge of any surveys being conducted and seemed confused about why someone would be photographing bin contents without notifying residents. That made me start paying closer attention to what was happening during our supposed bin collections, and I began noticing details that definitely weren't part of normal refuse service. The crew were collecting specific items from certain bins, placing them in separate containers rather than the main body of the lorry. They seemed to know exactly which houses to target and what they were looking for, suggesting this wasn't random sampling, but systematic collection based on prior intelligence. Most concerning was that they were taking items that clearly had personal significance. Photographs, documents, even clothing that people had discarded. The sort of things that could provide detailed information about household occupants and their personal circumstances. I realized that our weekly bin collection was being used as cover for systematic intelligence gathering about local residents, with discarded personal items being harvested for purposes that had nothing to do with waste management. But understanding what was happening didn't immediately clarify who was behind this operation, or what they planned to do with the personal information they were collecting from people's rubbish. I started researching whether other areas had experienced similar fake bin collections, hoping to understand the scope of what appeared to be systematic surveillance disguised as routine municipal services. What I found led me to websites that specialized in providing intelligence gathering services for various clients who needed detailed information about specific individuals or communities. The sites offered comprehensive profiling services based on analysis of discarded materials, with detailed breakdowns of what could be learned about people's lives, relationships, financial circumstances, and personal habits through systematic examination of their household waste. But these weren't legitimate investigation services working for law enforcement or established institutions. The platforms operated through hidden channels that avoided normal regulatory oversight, providing intelligence to clients who couldn't obtain this information through legal methods. The fake bin collection service was apparently one method among many for gathering personal intelligence that could be sold to people who wanted detailed information about specific individuals for purposes ranging from stalking to financial fraud. Discarded mail, photographs, personal documents, and even food packaging could offer detailed information about people's daily routines, relationships, health conditions, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by clients with various criminal intentions. But the most disturbing aspect was that this intelligence gathering was being conducted under perfect cover, using municipal services that residents expected and trusted to facilitate systematic invasion of privacy that would be nearly impossible to detect or prevent. People were unknowingly providing detailed information about their personal lives every week when they put their bins out for collection, never realizing that their discarded materials were being systematically harvested and analyzed by people who specialized in using this intelligence for harmful purposes. The fake refuse collection was probably just one part of larger operations that used various municipal and commercial services as cover for intelligence gathering that facilitated systematic targeting of residents for criminal purposes. But proving what was happening would require evidence that would be difficult to gather safely, since the people responsible had clearly developed sophisticated methods for conducting surveillance while maintaining the appearance of legitimate municipal services. Meanwhile, the intelligence gathering was probably continuing throughout the area, with new personal information being collected weekly from residents who remained unaware that their discarded materials were being systematically harvested and analyzed. I started being much more careful about what I put in my household bins, shredding documents that contain personal information, and disposing of sensitive materials through other methods that wouldn't make them available for collection by unauthorized individuals. But I also realized that most residents would never become aware of the systematic intelligence gathering that was being conducted through their weekly refuse collection, continuing to discard personal materials without understanding that they were providing detailed information about their lives to people who specialized in exploiting such intelligence. The bin collection that was supposed to be a routine municipal service had instead become a systematic method for gathering personal intelligence that could be used to facilitate various types of criminal targeting against residents who had no idea their privacy was being systematically violated. When I tried to warn neighbors about the fake refuse collections, most seemed skeptical about the possibility that such systematic surveillance could be conducted without official knowledge or authorization. The idea that municipal services could be infiltrated or impersonated for criminal intelligence gathering seemed too sophisticated and organized for most people to accept as a realistic threat to their personal privacy and security. But the intelligence gathering was probably continuing regardless of whether residents believed it was happening, with comprehensive personal profiles being built from discarded materials that people assumed would be safely destroyed through normal waste processing. Every week, when I saw the bins being collected, I wondered whether other residents were starting to notice the unusual attention their refuse was receiving, or whether the systematic intelligence gathering would continue indefinitely without detection. The refuse lorry that appeared on our street each Tuesday looked exactly like legitimate council vehicles, staffed by people who appeared to be normal municipal workers conducting routine collection services that residents had no reason to question or examine closely. When someone offers you cash in hand for courier work and emphasizes that discretion is more important than efficiency, there's usually a reason they can't use legitimate delivery companies. I probably should have questioned why they needed a driver who didn't ask questions. But when you're 3 weeks behind on rent and your car is about to be repossessed, you don't spend much time analyzing red flags. The job came through a contact at the pub, where I'd been drowning my sorrows after losing my warehouse position in Coventry. Manufacturing jobs had been disappearing from the area for months, and I'd finally been caught up in another round of redundancies. At 42, starting over wasn't exactly appealing, especially when most employers seem to prefer younger candidates who would work for less money. My drinking buddy Steve mentioned that he knew someone who needed reliable drivers for what he called special deliveries around the Midlands. The work paid considerably better than typical courier jobs, but it required complete discretion and the ability to follow specific instructions without asking unnecessary questions. Steve arranged a meeting with the contact, a well-dressed man who introduced himself simply as Martin. He explained that his business involved delivering sensitive materials to clients who valued privacy above all else. The packages were always small, the destinations were always specific, and the timing was always crucial. Martin emphasized that successful drivers needed to understand that they were being paid for reliability and silence rather than curiosity. The clients served by his operation often dealt with confidential business matters that required absolute discretion from everyone involved in the delivery process. The pay was attractive enough to solve my immediate financial problems, and the work seemed straightforward enough. I would receive text messages with addresses and specific instructions, collect packages from designated locations, and deliver them to the specified destinations without interacting unnecessarily with anyone involved. My first few deliveries were exactly as Martin had described. Small packages collected from ordinary-looking locations and delivered to residential addresses across Warwickshire and Staffordshire. The recipients were typically middle-aged professionals who seemed unsurprised by the deliveries and signed for them without conversation. The packages themselves were unremarkable. Small parcels wrapped in brown paper with no obvious identifying marks or return addresses. The delivery instructions were always precise about timing and approach, but nothing seemed particularly suspicious about the routine business transactions I was facilitating. However, I began noticing patterns in the delivery locations that suggested the operation involved more than typical business correspondence. Many of the pickup points were in areas that seemed inappropriate for legitimate commercial activities, and some of the delivery addresses were to properties that appeared to be unoccupied. The timing requirements for deliveries were also becoming more specific and unusual. I was often instructed to deliver packages at odd hours, or to leave them in particular locations, rather than handing them directly to recipients. Some deliveries required waiting until specific people left properties before approaching the delivery addresses. When I mentioned these unusual requirements to Martin, he explained that many of his clients operated businesses that required unconventional scheduling due to the sensitive nature of their work. Privacy concerns often necessitated deliveries outside normal business hours to avoid unwanted attention. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for legitimate business activities that required high levels of confidentiality. Corporate espionage and competitive intelligence were common concerns in many industries, and companies often took extraordinary measures to protect sensitive information. Around the fourth week of my employment with Martin's operation, I began receiving delivery instructions that involved significantly more complex logistics. Instead of simple package deliveries, I was asked to observe specific locations before making deliveries, documenting who was present and what activities were taking place. These surveillance requirements were presented as security measures necessary to ensure safe delivery of sensitive materials. Martin explained that many clients had concerns about industrial espionage or corporate surveillance, and delivery drivers needed to confirm that locations were secure before leaving valuable packages. The observation work was more time-consuming than simple deliveries, but it was also more interesting than typical courier duties. I found myself learning about the daily routines and activities of various people and businesses across the region, building detailed knowledge of locations and schedules that helped me plan more effective delivery strategies. However, the information I was gathering during these surveillance activities seemed to go far beyond what would be necessary for simple delivery security. I was documenting personal relationships, family circumstances, and lifestyle patterns that appeared irrelevant to ensuring safe package delivery. Some of the surveillance assignments involved observing residential properties where no deliveries were scheduled, suggesting that the intelligence gathering had become an end in itself rather than a means of facilitating deliveries. I was effectively conducting systematic surveillance of people who had no apparent connection to the delivery operation. When I questioned why surveillance was required for locations where no deliveries were planned, Martin explained that understanding the broader context of client activities was necessary for maintaining operational security. The delivery network served people whose business relationships were complex and sometimes required careful coordination. Around the sixth week of my involvement with the operation, Martin began providing me with specific devices and software that would enhance my surveillance capabilities. Small cameras that could be placed discreetly in various locations, recording devices that could capture conversations, and tracking applications that would monitor people's movements. These tools were presented as necessary equipment for advanced delivery security, allowing me to ensure that packages reached their intended recipients without being intercepted or observed by unauthorized parties. The technology would help me document that deliveries had been completed successfully and that client security had been maintained. The surveillance equipment was remarkably sophisticated, suggesting that Martin's operation had access to resources that went far beyond what would be available to typical courier services. The devices were professional grade and included features that would be useful for comprehensive intelligence gathering, rather than simple delivery confirmation. I began using this equipment to document not just delivery activities, but the broader circumstances and activities of the people and locations I was observing. The information I was gathering was becoming a comprehensive intelligence database about the personal and professional lives of people across the region. Martin seemed particularly interested in information about people's vulnerabilities and potential leverage points. He wanted detailed reports about financial difficulties, relationship problems, health issues, and other personal circumstances that might be useful for understanding how different people could be influenced or manipulated. This focus on psychological and social intelligence made me increasingly uncomfortable about the true purpose of the operation. The delivery work seemed to be providing cover for systematic intelligence gathering that had little to do with facilitating legitimate business transactions. When I tried to discuss these concerns with Martin, he reminded me that I had been gathering detailed intelligence about people and their circumstances for several weeks. This information was valuable and sensitive, and my knowledge of the operation's methods and targets made me an integral part of their security considerations. He also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that he could not have gathered through our professional relationship. References to my financial situation, daily routine, and personal relationships suggested that I had become a target of the same surveillance techniques I was using to gather intelligence about others. The surveillance of my activities became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my communications and movements were being monitored and documented. The equipment and techniques I was using to observe others were apparently being used to observe me as well. I realized that the delivery work had been used to recruit me into systematic surveillance operations that targeted vulnerable people for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate courier services. The packages I had been delivering were probably intelligence reports rather than business correspondence. The surveillance equipment I had been given was being used to gather detailed personal information about people who were being assessed for potential exploitation. My role had been to provide the intelligence needed to identify psychological vulnerabilities and leverage points that could be used for manipulation or control. When I attempted to withdraw from the operation entirely, Martin pointed out that I possessed detailed knowledge of surveillance techniques and had extensive information about people who were being monitored. This made me both a valuable asset and a potential security risk that could not simply be dismissed. The surveillance of my personal activities intensified after I tried to end my involvement with the operation. Martin's organization began sending me detailed information about my daily routine, social interactions, and personal vulnerabilities to demonstrate that they could apply their intelligence gathering techniques to my own life. I tried reporting my concerns to the police, but discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The courier work had been presented as legitimate delivery services. The surveillance equipment could be justified as security measures, and the intelligence gathering could be explained as necessary business research. Martin's operation continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering additional delivery work and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active and comprehensive. I never determined what the organization was ultimately using the detailed personal intelligence for, or who was directing their surveillance activities. The systematic gathering of information about people's vulnerabilities and personal circumstances, combined with sophisticated surveillance equipment and techniques, suggested capabilities that extended far beyond legitimate courier services. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for exploiting people's financial desperation to recruit unwitting participants in comprehensive surveillance operations. They understood how to present intelligence gathering as legitimate delivery work, while using the couriers as both surveillance operatives and potential targets for the same techniques. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my need for employment had been transformed into participation in systematic invasion of privacy for people who had no knowledge they were being monitored. The courier work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people desperate enough to ignore ethical concerns in exchange for steady income. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar courier and delivery services, offering cash work that pays well for what appears to be straightforward delivery assignments. The positions they advertise always emphasize discretion over efficiency, always involve unusual timing and location requirements, and always include responsibilities that go beyond typical courier work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other drivers have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate delivery services while actually participating in systematic surveillance operations that target vulnerable people for purposes they never intended to support. The text message was clearly meant for someone else, but when I tried to let them know they'd sent it to the wrong person, I discovered they already knew exactly who I was. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for lectures at Birmingham University. A simple message with just an address in Moseley and a time, 3 p.m. today. Nothing else. No context, no name, no explanation of what was supposed to happen at that location. I assumed it was a scheduling mix-up, someone trying to arrange a meeting or delivery who'd mistyped a phone number. Happens all the time, especially with university students constantly sharing contact details for group projects and social arrangements. I sent back a quick reply explaining that they'd reached the wrong person and might want to check their contact list. Simple courtesy that would hopefully ensure their actual intended recipient got the message they needed. The response came within minutes, and it made my stomach drop. Instead of acknowledging the mistake, they sent back a message that included my full name, my university course details, and my home address in student accommodation. Information that a random wrong number shouldn't have had any way of knowing. When I asked how they knew my personal details, the response was even more unsettling. They claimed we'd been in contact before and seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't remember our previous conversations. They referenced specific topics we'd supposedly discussed and mentioned arrangements we'd apparently made for ongoing communication. But I had no memory of any previous contact with this number, and the conversations they described didn't match anything I'd actually participated in. Either they were confusing me with someone else, or something much stranger was happening. I decided to check my phone's message history more carefully, looking for any previous contact with that number that I might have forgotten. What I found was disturbing. Dozens of messages between my phone and theirs, dating back several weeks, showing conversations that I was certain I'd never had. The message threads showed me apparently agreeing to meet with this person, sharing personal information about my daily routine, and even discussing plans for activities that I would never have consented to participate in. but I had no memory of sending any of these messages or having any of these conversations. Either someone else had been using my phone, or the message history had been fabricated in some way that made it appear I'd been in regular contact with a complete stranger. When I tried to call the number to demand an explanation, it went straight to a voicemail system that didn't identify the account holder. The recorded message was generic and professional, giving no indication of who might be behind the mysterious communications. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of the message history, records of when I'd supposedly sent messages that I didn't remember writing, even details about the conversations that had apparently taken place without my knowledge or participation. The pattern suggested that someone had been impersonating me through my own phone, conducting conversations and making arrangements as if they were me, while somehow preventing me from being aware of this activity. But the technical explanation for how this could happen was unclear. Unless someone had physical access to my phone, it should have been impossible for them to send messages from my number without my knowledge. I tried researching whether phones could be compromised in ways that would allow remote access to messaging functions, and found that sophisticated malware could potentially provide that level of control over someone's device. If my phone had been infected with surveillance software, someone could potentially monitor my activities, access my contacts and personal information, and even send messages that appeared to come from me while keeping me unaware of their activities. The realization that my phone might be completely compromised was terrifying. If someone had that level of access to my device, they could potentially monitor everything I did, every conversation, every location I visited, every piece of personal information I stored or accessed. But proving that my phone had been compromised would require technical expertise I didn't possess, and explaining the situation to university IT support or police would involve admitting that I'd been having mysterious conversations with unknown individuals about topics I couldn't remember discussing. Meanwhile, the messages from the mysterious contact continued arriving, with increasingly specific references to plans and arrangements that I supposedly knew about but had no actual knowledge of. They mentioned meeting locations around Birmingham, times when I was apparently expected to be available, and even payments for services that I'd supposedly agreed to provide. All presented as if these were normal ongoing arrangements that I should obviously remember and honor. When I tried to refuse to participate in whatever activities they thought I'd agreed to, they seemed genuinely confused and concerned about my apparent memory problems. They offered to provide documentation of our previous agreements and suggested that I might need medical attention if I was experiencing serious memory loss. The gaslighting aspect of the situation was almost as disturbing as the technical violation. Someone was systematically making me question my own memory and sanity while maintaining the pretense that our interaction was completely normal and consensual. But the most troubling development was when they started providing evidence of the arrangements I'd supposedly made. Photographs that appeared to show me in locations I didn't remember visiting. Documents that seemed to bear my signature on agreements I'd never seen before. Even financial records showing payments made from accounts in my name. Either I was experiencing serious memory problems that were affecting my ability to recall significant portions of my recent life, or someone had created comprehensive fake evidence of activities and agreements that had never actually occurred. The sophistication required to fabricate such detailed false documentation suggested this wasn't a simple prank or misunderstanding. Someone had invested significant resources into creating a false history of interactions and arrangements that could be used to manipulate me into participating in activities I would never have agreed to voluntarily. I tried to research whether other people had experienced similar situations. Mysterious communications claiming previous contact and arrangements that the recipients had no memory of making. What I found were scattered reports of people who discovered they were apparently participating in activities they had no knowledge of, with comprehensive documentation proving their involvement in arrangements they couldn't remember agreeing to. Most victims initially assumed they were experiencing memory problems or psychological issues, but investigation eventually revealed that they'd been targeted by sophisticated manipulation operations that used technical compromise and false documentation to create fake histories of consent and agreement. The operations were designed to make targets question their own memory and judgment, while gradually drawing them into activities that became increasingly difficult to escape from or explain to others. But proving that the false documentation was fabricated required technical and legal expertise that most individuals couldn't access, especially when the fake evidence appeared professionally created and legally valid. Meanwhile, the people behind these operations could continue manipulating their targets while maintaining plausible deniability about coercion or fraud, since the victims appeared to have willingly participated in all documented activities. I realized that I was probably being targeted for recruitment into some form of illegal activity, with the mysterious contact and false communication history being used to establish a foundation of apparent consent that could be used to justify increasingly serious demands. But extricating myself from the situation would be complicated by the fake evidence suggesting I'd already agreed to participate in activities I knew nothing about. Simply denying involvement would make me appear unreliable or dishonest, especially if the false documentation was professionally convincing. The safest approach seemed to be compliance with whatever minor initial requests they made, while gathering evidence that might eventually prove the fraudulent nature of the supposed agreements and arrangements. But each small compliance would provide additional material for creating more comprehensive fake documentation of my voluntary participation, making it even harder to prove coercion if the demands escalated to obviously illegal activities. I was trapped between immediate compliance and long-term manipulation, with no clear way to escape from a situation that had been designed to become progressively more difficult to resist or expose. When my phone rang at exactly the time and date mentioned in that first mysterious text message, the caller ID showed my own number calling me. I know how this is going to sound, but I need to talk about what happened. I used to think babysitting was about as safe as jobs get. You watch some kids, make sure they don't hurt themselves, maybe help with homework. Worst case scenario, someone's sick on your shoes or refuses to go to bed. I had no idea that looking after children could put you right in the middle of something genuinely horrifying. The opportunity came through a local mothers group in Hull, where I'd been volunteering after moving back home to help care for my elderly father. I'd worked in various childcare roles before relocating from London, and several women in the group had mentioned that they knew families who needed experienced babysitters for occasional evening work. One mother, Helen, said she could put me in touch with an agency that specialized in placing qualified childminders with families who required particularly reliable and discreet childcare. These families often had demanding careers that required unusual scheduling, and they were prepared to pay premium rates for babysitters who could adapt to irregular hours and maintain absolute confidentiality about family circumstances. The agency interview was more thorough than I'd expected for babysitting work. They conducted detailed background checks, requested references from previous childcare positions, and asked extensive questions about my experience with children of different ages and temperaments. They seemed particularly interested in my ability to remain calm under pressure and my willingness to follow specific instructions without questioning parental decisions. The agency manager explained that their client families often dealt with sensitive professional situations that required careful protection of their privacy. Children from these families were sometimes targeted by people seeking to exploit their parents' business relationships, which meant that babysitters needed to be particularly aware of security considerations. I was assigned to work with a family called the Weatherbys, who lived in a substantial house in one of Hull's more affluent areas. They had 2 children, aged 7 and 9, who were described as well-behaved and easy to manage. The parents traveled frequently for business and needed reliable evening childcare approximately twice per week. My first few babysitting sessions with the Weatherby children were exactly as advertised. The children were polite and cooperative, following established routines for dinner, homework, and bedtime without any difficulties. The house was comfortable and well-equipped, and the parents provided clear instructions for managing the children's schedules. However, I began noticing aspects of the household that seemed unusual for a typical family situation. The house contained security equipment that seemed excessive for residential use, including multiple cameras, motion sensors, and communication devices that suggested professional-grade surveillance systems. The children's behavior also seemed somewhat unusual, though not in ways that suggested mistreatment. They were extremely well trained in following security protocols, such as not answering the door under any circumstances and immediately reporting any unusual sounds or activities around the house. When I asked the children about these security measures, they explained matter-of-factly that their parents worked in industries that required careful protection of family privacy. They had been taught that discussing family activities with outsiders could create safety problems for everyone in the household. This seemed like reasonable precautions for families dealing with corporate espionage or competitive business pressures. Wealthy families often took security measures that would seem excessive to people from more ordinary circumstances, particularly when their business activities involve sensitive information. Around the 4th week of babysitting for the Weatherbys, I was asked to help with additional responsibilities that went beyond typical childcare duties. The agency explained that the family needed assistance with organizing household records and maintaining communication with various business contacts while the parents were traveling. These additional tasks involved managing correspondence, organizing files, and maintaining schedules for activities that seemed unrelated to typical family business. I was handling communications about meetings, transactions, and relationships that appeared to involve people from many different countries and business sectors. Some of the correspondence I was managing contained references to activities and arrangements that seemed inappropriate for legitimate business transactions. Discussions about transportation logistics, accommodation arrangements, and payment methods that suggested the family was coordinating activities that required significant secrecy and careful timing. When I expressed confusion about why childcare work involved managing such complex business correspondence, the agency explained that wealthy families often required household staff to provide comprehensive support that went beyond single-function roles. The boundaries between childcare, household management, and business assistance were often fluid in families with complex professional responsibilities. This seemed like a plausible explanation for legitimate work that happened to involve unusual responsibilities. Wealthy families did often expect household staff to handle various aspects of family and business management, particularly when travel schedules made it difficult for parents to manage everything directly. However, the specific nature of the business correspondence I was managing became increasingly concerning. Many of the communications involved coordinating meetings between the parents and people who were described in ways that suggested they were not typical business associates. References to ages, physical descriptions, and personal circumstances that seemed more relevant to personal relationships than business transactions appeared frequently in the correspondence I was organizing. The meetings being arranged often took place at unusual times and locations that seemed inappropriate for legitimate business activities. Around the 6th week of my work with the family, I discovered that some of the people being discussed in the business correspondence were individuals who had been reported missing in various parts of the country. The descriptions and personal details matched missing person reports that I recognized from local news coverage. The realization that I might be helping to coordinate activities involving missing people was deeply disturbing. The family's business activities appeared to involve people who had disappeared from their normal lives and were being moved through some kind of organized system. When I tried to discuss these concerns with the agency, they reminded me of the comprehensive confidentiality agreements I had signed when beginning work with the family. They emphasized that the business activities I was observing were complex legal matters that required careful protection from public scrutiny. They also pointed out that I had been managing sensitive correspondence and family information for several weeks, which meant that I had detailed knowledge of activities that could be misunderstood if taken out of context. My continued employment depended on maintaining absolute discretion about everything I had observed. The agency began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that they could not have gathered through our employment relationship. They made references to my father's health condition, my financial situation, and my living arrangements that suggested they had been conducting background research into my personal vulnerabilities. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my activities and communications were being monitored. The family and agency were apparently applying comprehensive intelligence gathering techniques to ensure my continued cooperation with activities I was beginning to understand were criminal. I realized that the babysitting work had been used to recruit me into participation in what appeared to be human trafficking operations. The children I was caring for were probably being used as props to create the appearance of normal family life, while their parents coordinated the movement and exploitation of vulnerable people. The correspondence I had been managing was likely coordination between traffickers rather than legitimate business communications. The security measures in the house were designed to prevent interference with criminal activities rather than protecting family privacy from business competitors. The missing people referenced in the correspondence were probably victims being moved through trafficking networks, and I had been unknowingly helping to coordinate their transportation and exploitation by managing communications between the people responsible for their disappearances. When I attempted to withdraw from the arrangement entirely, the agency pointed out that I had detailed knowledge of trafficking operations and could identify people involved in serious criminal activities. They suggested that my safety depended on continued cooperation rather than attempting to expose activities that involved dangerous people. The surveillance of my personal activities intensified after I tried to end my involvement with the family. The agency began sending me detailed information about my daily routine and my father's circumstances to demonstrate that they could threaten the safety of people I cared about if I caused problems for their operations. I tried reporting my suspicions to the police, but discovered that proving trafficking activities based on business correspondence and security measures was extremely difficult. The babysitting work had been presented as legitimate childcare. The household management tasks could be justified as normal responsibilities for wealthy families, and the correspondence could be explained as complex but legal business activities. The agency continued to contact me for several months after I stopped working for the family, offering additional childcare opportunities and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. I never determined the full scope of the trafficking operation or what happened to the people whose movements I had been unknowingly coordinating. The combination of legitimate family appearances, sophisticated security measures, and systematic coordination suggested an organization capable of moving people across significant distances while maintaining the appearance of normal business activities. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for recruiting unwitting accomplices to trafficking operations by presenting criminal coordination as legitimate household management work. They understood how to exploit people's need for income and their natural trust in childcare situations to recruit participants in activities they would never willingly support. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire to provide good childcare had been transformed into participation in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. The babysitting work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people who could be trusted with sensitive information and manipulated into maintaining silence about criminal activities. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar childcare agencies, offering well-paid positions with families who require particularly reliable and discreet babysitters. The positions they advertise always involve wealthy families with complex professional responsibilities, always require extensive confidentiality agreements, and always include household management duties that go beyond typical childcare work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other childcare workers have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate family support while actually participating in criminal operations that exploit the most vulnerable people in society. My brother Danny used to collect coincidences, not deliberately. He just had this habit of pointing out when things lined up in ways that seemed too convenient to be random. Like when his favorite band announced a concert on his birthday, or when the book he needed for a school project turned up in a charity shop the same day he got the assignment. He'd get this look on his face, half suspicious and half delighted, as if he'd caught the universe playing a trick on him. I've never been the type to believe in coincidences, but I am now. I've learned that sometimes what looks like pure chance is actually something much more deliberate, much more planned than you could ever imagine. And sometimes curiosity about the wrong thing can make you part of someone else's design without you ever realizing it. This is about my younger brother Danny. He was 15 when it happened, the kind of lad who spent most of his time online, but wasn't particularly tech-savvy. Just a normal teenager who played games, watched videos, and got into arguments on forums about things that didn't really matter. He lived with our mum in Nottingham after our parents split, and I'd see him every other weekend when he'd come to stay with me in Sheffield. He was always curious about things he wasn't supposed to know about. Not in a rebellious way. He just wanted to understand how the world actually worked. The trouble started when he read something online about hidden parts of the internet where you could find things that weren't available on normal websites, not just pirated content, but genuinely disturbing material that existed in spaces most people never knew about. During the summer holidays, he started researching these hidden networks, following links from one forum to another, slowly building an understanding of how to access parts of the internet that required special software. His first attempts were unsuccessful, mostly leading to dead links, but he persisted with that teenage conviction that there were secrets being kept from him. When he finally managed to access these hidden networks, most of what he found was disappointing. Defunct marketplaces, conspiracy forums, websites selling things he had no interest in. But he kept exploring, going deeper into increasingly obscure corners. The content became progressively stranger and more disturbing, moving from simple illegality into areas that made him genuinely uncomfortable. Yet something compelled him to continue. The breakthrough came when he found a forum dedicated to discussing live content. Users shared links and recommendations with the casual tone of people discussing television programs, rating what they'd seen, and making requests for specific types of content. Reading through these discussions, he began to understand that what he'd initially dismissed as internet mythology might actually exist. The sites themselves were primitive but functional. Basic interfaces, poor video quality, minimal features. But they worked well enough to stream content that was clearly authentic, rather than professionally produced fiction. What he found most unsettling was how organized it all seemed despite the amateur presentation. There were schedules, regular programming, someone coordinating activities across multiple streams. The forums contained discussions about how participants were recruited and managed. The process seemed to start with identifying vulnerable individuals through social media and gaming platforms, gradually building trust before making direct contact. Reading these discussions made him increasingly uncomfortable, but also more fascinated. Part of him knew he should stop, that he was seeing things no 15-year-old should see, but another part couldn't look away. What really caught his attention were the references to operations in the UK. Users shared information about potential targets and opportunities across different regions, including areas he recognized. The discussions about recruitment were particularly detailed. Users traded advice on social media monitoring, techniques for initiating contact, methods for gradually escalating involvement. He started noticing patterns in his own online activities that matched what he'd read about target identification. Gaming platforms, where he'd made friends with people he'd never met. Social media interactions with accounts that seemed designed to gather personal information, and messages from users who showed unusual interest in his daily routine and family situation. The realization that he might have accidentally identified himself as a potential target was genuinely frightening. His exploration of these networks would have left digital traces. His interest in the content would have been noted, and his online behavior would have been analyzed for vulnerabilities. By investigating their world, he'd made himself visible to people who specialized in exploitation. The direct contact began through private messages on one of the forums. Someone had been observing his posts and wanted to share more exclusive content that wasn't available in the public areas. The approach was gradual and friendly, presenting the interaction as a privilege rather than something that should raise suspicion. For a moment, he hesitated. Something about the message felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. But curiosity won out over caution, as it always seemed to with him. The private content was significantly more disturbing than what he'd seen in the open forums. Higher production values, more organized presentation, material that suggested the operators had serious resources and locations. Over several weeks, the private conversations became more personal. His contact showed interest in his life, his location, his family situation, and his daily routines. The questions were subtle and spread across multiple conversations, but collectively they built a detailed picture of his circumstances and vulnerabilities. The turning point came when his contact offered to arrange a meeting. Not dramatic or obviously threatening, just a suggestion that he might be interested in seeing how these operations actually worked, perhaps even contributing in some way. The proposal was presented as an opportunity rather than a demand, something that should feel exciting rather than dangerous. By this point, his judgment seemed completely compromised. The weeks of exposure to increasingly extreme content had normalized things that should have been immediately recognized as dangerous. His contact had skillfully managed the progression from curious observer to potential participant, using techniques that had clearly been refined through experience. The meeting was arranged for a weekend when he was supposed to be staying with me in Sheffield. Instead of taking the usual train, he was to meet his contact at a service station just outside Nottingham. The location was public enough to feel safe but isolated enough for privacy. Exactly the sort of place that would appear in the recruitment discussions he'd read. I didn't know any of this was happening. As far as I was concerned, he was coming to stay as usual, maybe arriving a bit later than normal, but nothing that seemed worth questioning. Our mum dropped him at the train station that Saturday morning, and we expected him to arrive in Sheffield by early afternoon. When he didn't turn up, we initially assumed he'd missed his connection or decided to meet friends instead. Teenagers don't always follow plans exactly, and he wasn't particularly reliable about keeping people informed of his movements. It wasn't until evening that we started to worry seriously. The police were helpful, but not particularly concerned at first. A 15-year-old missing for less than 24 hours wasn't unusual, especially during school holidays when kids often made spontaneous plans with friends. They took details and assured us they'd investigate, but their tone suggested this would resolve itself quickly. His phone was switched off, his social media accounts showed no recent activity, and none of his friends had heard from him since the previous evening. The complete silence was unusual for someone who normally maintained constant online contact with various people throughout the day. The investigation revealed that he'd never boarded the train to Sheffield. CCTV from the station showed him leaving the building shortly after our mum had dropped him off, walking towards the car park rather than the platforms. After that, the trail went cold completely. Police found his online activities eventually, but understanding what they meant required technical expertise that took time to arrange. By the time they'd pieced together his exploration of hidden networks and identified his contact, weeks had passed and any physical evidence had long since disappeared. The forums he'd been using went offline shortly after his disappearance. Not just the specific sites he'd visited, but entire sections of the network seemed to shut down and relocate. Whether this was coincidental timing or a deliberate response to increased attention was impossible to determine. His contact's identity proved impossible to trace. The account had been carefully constructed to avoid revealing any genuine personal information, using technical methods that made investigation extremely difficult. The conversations they'd had contained no references to real locations or identifiable details. 6 months later, we're still waiting for answers that will probably never come. His disappearance has been classified as suspected abduction, but there's no evidence of who might be responsible or where he might have been taken. Sometimes I wonder if his curiosity was genuinely random, or if he was deliberately guided towards those networks by people who were already watching for suitable targets. The coincidence of him discovering exactly the right forums, connecting with exactly the right person, and being offered exactly the opportunity that would appeal to his personality seems almost too convenient to be accidental. I think about the techniques they described for identifying and approaching targets, the systematic way they built trust before making their move. Everything that happened to him followed patterns that were discussed openly in those forums, as if his entire experience was just another implementation of proven methods. His initial discovery might not have been accidental at all. His online activities could have been monitored and guided. His curiosity deliberately cultivated by people who specialized in recruiting vulnerable individuals. That's why I believe in coincidence now. Not because things happen randomly, but because recognizing patterns helps you see when they might be something more deliberate. Danny used to collect coincidences like they were treasures. Now I wonder if he became one himself.